support this deal. Why are they so wrong?
Well, I want to go through the reasons why they are wrong. But because this deal, first of all, on the problem, the mythical problem along the border, a problem which does not exist. If you look at current practice, trade can go across the Irish border at present with taxes being collected, goods checked for conformity in regulations, animal health being protected, and yet we don't need a hard border. And indeed, all of the parties to this agreement have said that they will not, in any circumstances anyhow, have a hard border. Not only a couple of weeks ago, the EU and the Irish government were assuring us that even if there's no deal, there will not be a hard border imposed, because a hard border is not necessary. What we have in this withdrawal agreement about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the UK Protocol is only designed to do one thing, and that is to thwart the wishes of the people of the United Kingdom in leaving the EU. Because we have only a number of options. Either the UK as a whole stays in the single market and the customs union, or if they wish to free themselves from that, Northern Ireland has to stay within the single market and the customs union. And indeed, I defy any member of this House to say they could go back to their constituents and tell them what the Attorney-General told the Cabinet was going to happen to their constituents and find that they wouldn't be chased. That first of all, their constituency would have to regard the rest of the UK as a third country. That secondly, and the implications of that, would be that they could not trade freely with the rest of the UK. They would have barriers placed between their part of the UK and the rest. That businessmen would face all of the impediments, and indeed the legal opinion makes it quite clear there would be friction of trade. In other words, there would be additional costs, additional delays, additional barriers, and there would be distortions to trade. And yet that is what this agreement entails for Northern Ireland. And the only way we can get out of that is to do one of two things. Either to reach a future trade arrangement, which the EU says is sufficient to allow us to completely be out of that arrangement. They could even insist if you reach a free trade arrangement, you still have to partly stay within those restrictions, including over 300 EU regulations which would be applied to Northern Ireland, and just in case they've missed any, they say, and any future which fall within the any future new ones which fall within the scope of this would also have to apply as well. So we would have different laws from the rest of the United Kingdom. And I will give way.
I'm very grateful for giving away. The Northern Irish National Farmers Union have been very clear that the Prime Minister's deal is in the best interests of farmers in Northern Ireland. Why are the Northern Irish NFU wrong?
And this is a surprising thing. The Northern Ireland Farmers Union, if they read this agreement, Article 12 of the Northern Ireland Protocol makes it quite clear that because state aid rules would apply to Northern Ireland, that even if this UK government decided to subsidise agriculture, the EU could cap any subsidy. The subsidy could apply differently in the rest of the UK than it would apply in Northern Ireland. And I could take you through a whole range of other things in this agreement that the Ulster Farmers Union conveniently have just dismissed, and which will have an impact on their own members. One of the reasons why many farmers in my constituency are raging with the Ulster Farmers Union. But one way is to have a free trade arrangement, which may or may not, and the EU may or may not deem to allow us to get out of this, away from these shackles. But of course, and the Attorney-General makes it quite clear, that although best endeavours to reach a free trade agreement are required, even with best endeavours the EU could argue, we have done our best, but it is still not in our interests. And 16 years later, they could still be arguing we're doing our best, but still not be in breach of the obligations in this agreement. And of course we already know, and Scottish members should be aware of this, we already know that the French government have already said they will use this as a lever, a cudgel, in order to get further concessions from the UK government in terms of fishing and in terms of aviation and other things. And every other UK country or EU country will be doing the same and using the same tactic. So that's not an easy way out. We could still be negotiating this, and indeed it's significant that the other method of getting out is for us to extend the transition period. And there is great ambition shown in this document about the extension of the transition period. Many people think when they talk about extending the transition period, we're talking about a few months. Well, according to this document, and it puts it down in this, it could be extended to 20XX. We could be at this in another 100 years. This place could be refurbished, rebuilt by the time we have got a free trade arrangement to replace the backstop. And the impact of this on, first of all, the constitutional and integrity of the United Kingdom is that Northern Ireland would be treated differently than other parts of the United Kingdom, something the Prime Minister promised would never happen. And Northern Ireland industries, which are more export-orientated than any other region of the UK, because we have a very small local market. We produce a third of the world's aircraft seats. You sit in row C and F, you have probably sat in a seat made in Kilkeel. We produce 40% of stone crushing equipment in the world. All of that goes to markets mostly outside the EU, and yet we would be excluded from participating in any trade deals that our government might arrange with the rest of the world. That's because we would be part of the customs union, permanently part of the customs union, unless this backstop was lifted. And this backstop can only be lifted if and when the EU decide it is time to lift it. I've got to say in this House today, we had an arrangement, and I'll say this to the front bench, we had an arrangement to keep the government in power and keep the government working between now and the end of this fixed-term Parliament. Promises were made. Promises in December. We sat with the Prime Minister in Downing Street where she said, I will make sure that Northern Ireland has the final say in this because the Assembly will be the final arbiter as to whether or not these arrangements are put in place. They were taken out of the agreement. There has been bad faith. The agreement and the understanding we had been broken. And as the member for the Forest of Dean Maiden pointed out in his speech, that has caused tensions. And going down this road will create further tensions. And we want to see the agreement honoured because we want to see the United Kingdom preserved.
Nigel Evans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's great to follow my honourable friend from East Antrim with his siren warnings as to what could happen over the coming weeks and months if we don't listen. I understand people are talking to the DUP. It's about time people started listening to the DUP, and that's a huge difference in what's happening. I'm not one of the MPs who's stood up and waxed lyrical on this issue over the past 2 years, like some members in this chamber. There's barely a debate gone by without certain members standing up and sharing their beliefs as to what they believe is right. And I've heard lots today spoken about honesty and transparency and treating people like adults. Well, that's a good idea, because in 2016 we had a people's vote. For anybody to even suggest that another referendum would be the people's vote because the last one wasn't is totally and wholly fraudulent. It's ridiculous. A people's vote was held in 2016. We allowed it to be held, the members of Parliament in that Parliament then, and it was held. And surprise, surprise, it wasn't what people thought was going to happen in the main. I remember watching the result. There's no exit poll. The pound is up. Shares are up. Nigel Farage has conceded defeat. And then, of course, the results started coming in. Now, people who live within the bubble of London could be forgiven for thinking that Remain was going to win. But what happened, of course, swathes of people in the northeast, the northwest, the southwest, who feel as if nobody is listening to them, that they're the invisible people. But thanks to David Cameron, they were given a voice. And they used that voice. And the voice said, leave. And now, all of a sudden, they're facing this Parliament, whereby this Parliament is talking about, not only don't we see you, now we've decided not to listen to you. And that is wholly dangerous. Wholly dangerous indeed. When we give a referendum, we really do need to respect the results. When I was a shadow in 1997, 50.3% in favour, 49.7% against, on a 50.1% turnout. And what did we do? We conceded. It was about under 7,000, actually, the difference between yes and no. But we conceded that that's what should happen, and devolution.
Telling us that we should be doing, which is why we wanted to get out of the EU in the first place.
It's worse than that. It's worse, because there again, let's go honesty and treat people like adults. The people's vote, right? Because we didn't have one last time when 35 million people voted. What should be the options? Oh, from the honourable member from Putney. 3. Vote for the deal that the government's got, which I hardly speak to anybody who thinks it's any good. Then there is the cliff edge, which most people believe can be avoided and really don't want, or the stay in the European Union, which the people rejected in 2016. So that's not fair. Just because, I mean, let's be honest again, in this Parliament, we are told that we can't get to a decision that everybody will agree with. We have to accept that during the referendum, the vast majority of members of Parliament voted and campaigned for Remain. We are in a Remain Parliament, which happens to reside in a Leave country. And I think it's wholly dangerous for us to turn to the people now and say, you let us down. You got it wrong. Do you know what else is said about people who voted Leave? That they were a bit thick, that they didn't know what they were voting for. And we've had intimations of maybe they were racist. Well, no, they weren't. They weren't racist. Immigration was only part of it, but the sovereignty of making decisions in this Parliament, which is what it was all about, immigration being part of that. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. But would he agree with me that following the Welsh devolution debate, there was not a public inquiry required into the funding of the various campaigns, and that there was not, at that point, the technological advances and the questionable use of Facebook and other social media because of the number of years which have elapsed. So it's not really comparing apples with apples.
Well, it is apples and apples, and it's just simply because there are people here who are now using any excuse to try and ignore the result, to try and turn it over because they didn't like the campaign, they think that people lied on one side or the other, and in fact, those accusations are levelled at both campaigns. And don't forget, on top of that, the government spent £9.3 million on a brochure that they sent to every household in this country using taxpayers' money. Propaganda to try and convince them, every household in this country using taxpayers' money. Propaganda to try and convince them into voting Remain. And on the back of that pamphlet, I objected to the pamphlet at the beginning, but on the back of it, David Cameron put one paragraph that said, "We will accept the verdict of the British people." So I say to people in this chamber, please be careful what you wish for with the Attorney General's advice, and I do really have specific problems with the backstop. The more I've read this advice, the more I dislike it. I didn't like it before, but now I like it even less. I love the mentions of good faith and best endeavours. The last time I heard best endeavours, I was a boy cub. Really, is that the best we can try for? And I did hear the Prime Minister say that we will not have any borders down the Irish Sea when explicitly this is what is now going to happen. I am very, very unhappy with that. Although I did listen to the Prime Minister at Question Time today, and I got some sort of hope from what she responded to one of the questions as to what's going to happen on Tuesday. If all of a sudden we're legal risk that the United Kingdom might become of negotiations. Think about it. When not only are we treating Northern Ireland differently, but we don't know how long it's going to last. Is that where we want to be? Is that what the British people voted for in 2016? I do not think so. I've heard a rumour that the Prime Minister is thinking about a change by saying that perhaps Parliament should be able to vote to put us into the backstop, giving Parliament that power. I don't want that power. Getting into the backstop isn't the problem. It's getting out of the backstop that is the problem. That's where we need to be making the decision in this Parliament, to be able to have that decision, to say, thank you, we're leaving. Harold Wilson said, politics is the art of the possible. And now, and Rab Butler as well, well, he probably paraphrased him. All I can say is, over to you, Prime Minister. Let's see where the art of the possible takes us on Tuesday, but for goodness sake, don't take this to defeat.
Paul Faraday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And at the outset, I really want to congratulate the Honourable Member for East Surrey on a very powerful speech earlier, rooted in reality, and also the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield on the successful passage of his amendment yesterday. He has been truly outstanding through all these Brexit debates. For very good reason, Mr. Speaker. I want to use this occasion too to say a fond farewell to my German teacher, Keith Walker, from my old school of Woolstanton in Newcastle-under-Lyme. Keith passed away a fortnight ago, and his funeral's on Friday. And Mr. Walker, as we called him back then, was instrumental in helping me form my views on Britain's right and proper place at the heart of Europe. His wonderful teaching made sure I got a place to study German at Oxford. And it was because of Keith that I first took part, and then for 6 years helped to organise international youth exchanges in Berlin with the German War Graves Commission, when the wall was the starkest reminder of the outcome of the Second World War and of the Cold War that followed. And Mr. Speaker, during the trading of facts and fictions during the disastrous 2016 referendum, the historical perspective very much got completely lost. Yes, the European Union could be frustrating. It wasn't perfect, like everything, but from its origins after the war as the European coal and steel community through to the common market, it's been very much part of the architecture of peace, trade, dialogue and prosperity in our times. And could you ever imagine that the states of the former Yugoslavia would have engaged in such shameful bloodletting had they been part of a European community to which we've belonged for 45 years, and membership of which was confirmed by 67% of our people at the first referendum in 1975. Now fast forward to the debacle of 2016. My constituency, my hometown, Newcastle-under-Lyme, voted around 60-40 to leave. And it's hardly a secret that I profoundly disagree with that verdict. Aside from matters of economy and trade, history shows that when Britain has disengaged from European affairs, it has not only harmed our national interest, but the national interests of countries on the continent as well. We've had, and still have, very much to offer. When the subject of Brexit came up on the doorstep last year, I politely, I hope, disagreed with people of a Leave persuasion, and then we moved on to discussing the state of our local hospital and the potholes in the road. And for all the heat that we feel at Westminster, most people were simply not obsessed about Europe. The great reasonable majority want us to get this right in the national interest, and, Mr. Speaker, for all the reasons that most of the speakers have outlined today, the Prime Minister's deal does not serve that national interest. In Newcastle, we campaigned in the referendum as passionately as at any general election. And at the start, it was possible to have a fairly reasonable debate. Quite a number of people whom I'd known for many years and would have sworn were Leavers said their heart was without, but the head said, stay in for jobs, investment, kids and opportunities for the future. So it was possible to have a decent discussion until a fortnight or so before voting day, that is. And then, at the entrance to my town, like many up and down the land, the big red banner posters went up, Turkey, population 76 million, is joining the EU, vote Leave, photographs of queues of refugees mingled to great effect with an old-fashioned blue British passport. And it was, of course, Mr. Speaker, an outright lie. But it was impossible to get that through, because the response immediately, time and again, was, what are you going to do about the Turks? Well, I didn't know at that time that this message was not only being shouted out from old-fashioned billboards, but it was reverberating, exaggerating around social media in targeted dark ads that Remainers like me would never see. And this has only been become clear since our DCMS Select Committee's inquiry into fake news involving Facebook in particular. And of course, that inquiry has followed up on breaches of the law and spending limits by both May and Leave campaigns. But just 2 years on, I don't want to cry about spilt milk. What I think the last 2 years have shown is that people are now much better informed about the consequences of exactly how we leave, if indeed we do. And Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister loses next week's vote, we're in interesting territory to say the least. But I think one thing must be certain. No matter how much she tries to cling on, in the hope of making amends for her disastrous election performance last year, the Prime Minister really has to go, like her predecessor did after the referendum result. And then the question for us will be whether the House can form a majority to chart the way forward, or whether this can only be settled by a general election or a referendum. Mr. Speaker, I view the prospect of another people's vote with more than trepidation. I don't know how it's going to be possible to have that reasonable debate when the poll will be framed by shrieks of betrayal from most of our printed press, reinforced by deep pockets using and abusing the echo chamber of social media. But if that is the only road ahead, we should not shirk from holding that vote. And come an election, Mr. Speaker, or a referendum, I'll be making the same arguments again. I firmly believe that it's in Britain's national interest to remain within the European Union, with a seat at the table, with a vote, and sometimes a veto, to reform where needed from within, not just to shout from the sidelines without, nor under this deal to go cap in hand begging for favours in the future.
Extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. John Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Newcastle under Lyme. In many respects, we have the classic issue for MPs. What are their priorities? Is it their personal view? Is it that of their constituency? What is the view of their party? Should they be following that? And indeed, ultimately, making the decision in the national interest. And generally speaking, this never really crops up as such, but we live in unusual circumstances. We have to acknowledge that parties are fundamentally split. MPs' views can be very much at variance with those of their own constituency. So the dilemma for each and every one of us is, what do we as individual MPs believe is in the national interest? And I look over the last 2.5 years, and I appreciate hindsight is a wonderful thing, but I do look back at some key mistakes that have been made. The red lines that were set out by the Prime Minister, in many respects, when you go into negotiation, you don't really lay down what your views are before you actually enter into those negotiations. Then the election itself, the early calling of that, when we did actually have a working majority. And of course, the triggering of Article 50. In many respects, when you look back, we should have prepared all the legislative requirements, the bills, and get them passed into acts before we even thought about triggering Article 50. And indeed, we should have had a national debate about exactly what our long-term relationship with the EU should be. But at the end of the day, we are where we are. And the government is suggesting that there are now 3 alternatives: no deal, remain, second referendum, or the government's own proposals. What I know and fully accept is that we voted in 2016 to leave the EU institutions, and I think we definitely have to respect that. But the nature of our future relationship still has to be decided, and that is for Parliament to decide. And therefore, when I look at the 3 options that are effectively set out by government, I do not support a second referendum. I think it would be unnecessary, I think it would be divisive, and indeed I wonder what it would actually achieve. And I also have to look at the question of going back into the EU, or remaining in the EU. I cannot see how that would be sensible now, because there will undoubtedly be a changed relationship with our EU partners. As for no deal, I find that equally unpalatable. I do not believe it is in our country's interests. I actually think it would lead to a recession and make us a poorer country. It is not in the interests of our national economy, and is certainly not in the interests of my constituents. Therefore, the government have to argue that the only real option would be to support the government's position, that is the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. And I, like many others, have concerns about the withdrawal agreement, but I don't feel there's any necessity for me to go into that, because I think they've been well expressed by other members already. Then we have the political declaration, and again that does raise concern for me, and again many of these issues have been raised by other honorary members. We would end up with 2 years of negotiation before we even got a deal, if we did in fact get a deal within that period. I do question whether the unity the EU would hold, because they themselves would have different competing national interests. And I wonder where we would actually end up with regards to that negotiation. Nevertheless, we have to await the decision of Parliament next Tuesday to see whether or not that is the course that we are to take. But I do actually believe that there is an alternative. There is a fourth option, and it's one that I believe is acceptable to the EU, fully understood by all, and that is simply EFTA-EEA. Simply put, this would allow us to have an independent agricultural policy, independent fisheries policy. We would not be part of the ECJ, it would be the EFTA court that would determine decisions. There would be no payments to the EU, and indeed we would have membership of the single market. And I've never quite understood why people are so hostile to membership of the single market, because what we're proposing to do is actually to enter into a free trade agreement. What is a free trade agreement? It is an attempt to get rid of tariffs and to get rid of regulatory differences between economies. So I actually genuinely believe that staying in the single market is in the interests of our country. I accept, though, there is the issue of free movement. But again, I do question this. We do have the emergency brake under Section 112 of the EEA, and indeed, if we actually accept the reality, more immigration comes from out with the EU than comes from within the EU, and we have absolute control over that. I also think that this proposal would have widespread support across both sides of this House. It would ensure that we are actually out of the EU, we're out of the political project, we're out of any sort of union, but we are back to the common market ideals of old, which I think have always been supported by the people of this country. But I would also remind this House that relationships change. The EU will change with our departure, and it will continue to do in other ways that we probably haven't thought of at present. EFTA would also develop. With the arrival of a very large economy, it would change the dynamics of EFTA, and it would become, I think, a much more significant player. And the relationship between the EU and EFTA itself would change because of that arrival of a larger economy, and I think EFTA's importance would clearly increase significantly. Mr. Speaker, I make these comments on EFTA to remind the House that there is a potential alternative should the government lose the vote next week, and it's one that I would certainly support. But on Tuesday we have to weigh up what we as individual MPs believe is in the national interest. I certainly believe that no deal or remain are not sensible alternatives now. Whether the political declaration could offer us a route to a sensible future relationship with the EU is a judgment which we will all have to make on Tuesday. But I do genuinely believe that should that vote not go ahead or be defeated on the government's proposal be defeated next Tuesday, that there is a genuine and real alternative.
Ivan Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the honourable member for Carlisle on membership of EFTA and the EEA, and I'll come on to that later in my speech. It's fallen to this generation of politicians to make one of the most profound decisions outside of war that this country has ever had to make. The referendum result exposed a deeply divided country, with many voters wanting to send a strong message to elites, whether political or business, that government and the economy, whether national or European, is not delivering for them. Wage stagnation and rapid migration fueling alienation and resentment. The Prime Minister is fond of talking of the national interest, but the whole Brexit shambles is a consequence of the eternal European fault line in the Conservative Party. The shambles of a negotiation which has left our country a laughingstock has been caused by red lines which may as well have been written in invisible ink, and the dogma of some hard Brexiteers who prefer a scorched earth Brexit. They can afford years of poor growth, unlike my constituents whose jobs and living standards are on the line. Mr. Speaker, the problem with our negotiating position from the beginning is that the starting point was not the national interest, but an ill-fated attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable factions in the Cabinet and the Parliamentary Conservative Party. And we've ended up with the worst of all worlds deals. A deal, Mr. Speaker, which has united the leader of the opposition and the Democratic Unionist Party. That took some doing, Mr. Speaker. And it's also united Leavers and Remainers in opposition. I want to turn to the notion of a people's vote. I'm extremely sceptical. I recall many who now advocate a people's vote were the biggest critics of David Cameron for holding the first referendum. And in the internal debate which took place in the Labour Party, good and honourable friends now supporting a second vote were the most vociferous persuaders in ensuring an EU referendum was not in our election manifesto. If determining our future in the EU by referendum was wrong in principle in 2015, 2016 and 2017, why is it right now? Of course I deplore the untruths promoted by the Leave campaign, including false promises. But if this is justification for a second vote, I suggest that many general election results through history would be null and void. The only certainty about the result of a second referendum is it would once again expose the fact that we remain deeply divided as a nation. But worse than that, having a second vote, even if it results in a decision to remain, will fuel support for nationalism, hard-right politics and politicians like never before. The elite telling the people they got it wrong and we know best. Have we learnt nothing, Mr. Speaker, from political earthquakes erupting around the world? And I say this to my Labour friends. Even if a second vote results in a victory for Remain, this may turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory. Because we were in the EU when for 18 years Thatcherism destroyed the fabric of communities and our society. We've been in the EU since 2010, while we've seen the poorest suffering the most as a consequence of austerity. There is nothing more likely to perpetuate right-wing governments than a backlash against a second vote supported and promoted by progressives. Of course it's right to ask whether we will be worse off if we leave the EU. But it's also right to ask who will suffer the most if, through an apparent contempt for half of the population, we consign our country to long-term right-wing governments. Mr. Speaker, it's incumbent on all of us not simply to oppose this bad deal and no deal, but to present an alternative as the honourable member suggested. And I've come to the conclusion that the best, if far from perfect, option, which crucially could secure a majority in this place, is so-called Norway Plus. I accept this will only become possible when honourable members' first preferences are defeated. But I believe a significant majority in this House will act in a way envisaged by the honourable member's amendment passed last night and unite around this option as the best, only viable option to no deal. It's not perfect, but it respects the referendum result while providing the stability to ensure a relatively smooth economic transition. Mr. Speaker, since the referendum, the government have let the people of this country down very badly. They failed to seek a cross-party consensus when that was possible and was required by such a close result, and instead they've allowed the dysfunctional Tory family on Europe to create a dysfunctional country much diminished in the world. The Prime Minister hasn't listened, and in the case of Northern Ireland has clearly breached trust. It isn't just a question of substance with politicians representing Northern Ireland in this House, it's a question of a sense of being told untruths. And that's why members of goodwill on all sides must make the best use of yesterday's amendment, assert the authority of Parliament and show what acting in the national interest truly means. Only then will we put the country on a path to a better future and maybe even regain some public confidence and respect. Because what honourable members need to reflect on outside of this House is the public's contempt for the fact that they asked this group of politicians to make this decision on Brexit in the national interest. And all they see is a disastrous situation where the government has negotiated a shoddy deal and Parliament seems absolutely incapable of coming together and working together in the national interest. If, as we expect, Mr. Speaker, next week, the amendments and the substantive motion are defeated, it is incumbent on all of us in this House to unite, not around the ideal, but around a solution which is pragmatic and which actually represents the best interests of this country. And I urge people to give serious consideration to Norway Plus in that context.
Mr. Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Bury South. And there is a better plan, there is a better future than this friendless withdrawal agreement, one free of fear. And the way to unify, as he was saying, is to lead and show what that alternative is. But it's not Norway plus a customs union. That would make us a rule taker with no autonomy. It would be against the referendum result and our manifesto pledges. We would continue to pay money, and there would continue to be freedom of movement. It would still require a withdrawal agreement, which we all hate, and it doesn't settle the issue. It would just create more uncertainty for business and for people in this country. We need to go for an advanced free trade agreement and replace the protocol on Northern Ireland with something that will still give confidence to communities in the island of Ireland. And we can provisionally apply such an agreement if a plan and a schedule is agreed for zero tariffs, so that that can persist after the end of March. It can have efficient, cheap processes for all of our borders, which business can deal with, and free trade rules that accumulate so that supply chains don't suffer dislocation. It's a future that we can have, but we need to ask for it and not give in. It doesn't mean we have to leave in a disorderly way. We can continue to talk constructively about how we can be friends and allies and the best arrangements for that. And for me, money can remain on the table. That's fair enough. Give and take and compromise are okay for me. But we must do this as separate sovereign jurisdictions. And both sides must now prepare. When they hear that, I think that there will be relief on their side. They will know that what they're dealing with, that they will have interlocutors that they can have frank, constructive dealings with, knowing that there are limits. The EU are not bullies. I think that disrespects them. They are, though, what they are, which is a bureaucracy whose natural imperative is to push limits. And if we don't show where they are, they have no reference point as to where to stop. But we have to stand strong at this point. The truth is that the withdrawal agreement before us is not a compromise, but a capitulation, out of a misunderstanding and fear, and out of letting the EU make the running, letting it set the schedules, agendas and the text. And this is sadly what has led our country and our democracy to the chopping block, trussed up for the EU's feast. It's a tragic misconception of the economics and the practicalities, I think, by those who have never really properly applied themselves. So yes, I have been very critical of our cabinet and the front bench, and I think that that is justified. And I'm not afraid to say why. There is certainly a better way to do this. The forecasting has been wrong. The countries that have offered us free trade have been rebuffed, and experience and knowledge within government and within departments and in the civil service has simply been ignored. So it makes me wonder why. Is it because we have a government full of EU ideologues? Or are they just afraid, perhaps because they don't understand how trade and can be really efficient, and how cross-border supply chains can sit well in a trade agreement framework outside the EU? So it isn't really a case of whether the perfect is the enemy of the good. The point is that there is a better plan, and the PM's deal, I'm afraid, is in no sense good. It really is a very bad agreement, and it's not something that the government has modelled, because I don't think that they dare. In the backstop element of the withdrawal agreement, there are lots of things which we've heard about that are not good. The joint decision in the joint committee that is required, unless there's a superseding agreement, essentially guarantees pretty much that there will be pain for this country. In the backstop, our interlocutors will have massive leverage, and they will have hostages to fortune. They will have us where they want us, and it's just wrong to say that it will be uncomfortable for them. I believe it's either naive, or it's delusional, or it could be worse. It would put us as a captive into a customs union with antiquated procedures, wet stamps, for goodness sake, on physical pieces of paper. Well, I tell you, Toyota won't like that one little bit. They should be embarrassed, this government, of this deal, because it really is that bad. Have the Treasury modelled what it would cost to do this wet stamping process for industry? When you look at third country trade on current EU rules, it only costs about 0.3% of the value of consignments. The Treasury is forecasting have 11% for the car industry. Now they must have these wet stamps in mind, because in modern customs it ain't that expensive, anything like. So it really is a matter of trying to see what we can do now. There are other hostages there. I've mentioned before what I've discovered, which is that state aid would apply to our defence industry in the backstop. That is an outrageous change, and it gives our sovereign ability in defence wholly to the EU to decide how competitive that is. I've asked 5 cabinet members now whether they know about this. None of them know, and I think you need to read the agreement properly. I will be circulating a note about it later tonight so that members can make up their own minds. But there are 123,000 jobs all over our country in Labour constituencies, SNP, all of us. And this is just not an acceptable state of affairs for our national government to be putting us into. So I implore colleagues, say no to this humiliating servitude that's been served up for us. It would be the cause of shame for generations to come. There's a better way to do this.
Thank you. Jim Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, I think this is probably one of the most important debates that I've ever taken place in this House, and we have had quite a few important debates in the past. But if we start to certainly looking at my constituency and probably looking at constituencies up and down the country, we're actually talking about the future, as it were, of our young people and their future, just as much as we're talking about our constituents today and their interests today. And if we look at the effect on the economy, the GDP, the Treasury's analysis suggests that this deal will leave the economy 3.9% smaller after 15 years than it would if we'd stayed in the EU. And unsurprisingly, it also shows that any form of Brexit will leave us facing a huge economic loss. Of course, though, the worst-case scenario is a no-deal Brexit, which would leave us 9.3% worse off over the same 15-year period. No-deal Brexit, however, we did not need this analysis to tell us that no deal is a significant threat to this country. But the choice facing us today is not a bad deal or no deal. There is strong economic grounds for us to vote down this deal and for us to seek a different Brexit with the EU or to remain as we are. Manufacturing in Coventry has a long history of manufacturing, and 11,000 people in my constituency work in the manufacturing industry. Because of this, I've had regular meetings with some of the biggest manufacturers in Coventry. For example, Jaguar Land Rover, Meggitt and the London Electric Vehicle Company. Throughout the Brexit negotiations, they have been concerned over what Brexit means for future business in the EU. And anybody that knows anything about manufacturing knows that your manufacturers need at least to have some stability to look forward 4 or 5 years. And in the aircraft industry, sometimes it's a lot longer than that. So they need some stability. This deal doesn't actually give them that. The government has reacted to some concerns, but they haven't provided enough information for businesses to plan long term, as I've already indicated. Their failure to convince business is shown most of all by the leaked CBI email, which showed their true opinion that this is not a good deal. All businesses need stability in order to plan ahead and protect the jobs of our constituents. This deal offers no stability and is a stab in the dark which puts jobs of my constituents at risk. Therefore, I will not be joining the CBI in backing a deal that I and they have great reservations with. If this deal is defeated on Tuesday, it will set us on a path to either a different Brexit, one that puts the jobs of my constituents before the ideology of some of the PM's backbenchers, As well as our skill and success in manufacturing, I'm lucky to represent a constituency with two world-class universities, Coventry and Warwick. And incidentally, research and development is very important for Coventry and Warwick universities as much as it is for manufacturing, like companies like Jaguar Land Rover. They bring huge benefits to the local economy, but also to the UK as a result of a cutting-edge research, contributing 1.8 billion in GDP annually. So they are a crucial part of our community and our economy, just the same as other universities are across the country. I've been in touch with both universities to see what this deal would mean for them. Unsurprisingly, they are not willing to back a deal which does not even mention the word university once in its entire 585 pages. Since 2010, they've received close to 100 million in EU funding. No mention of replacing that in this agreement. When you also consider that the Universities Minister has resigned over this deal, it's clear that this deal does not deliver for students or the universities. Both universities are outward-looking institutions with strong links to Europe. This is shown by the fact that around 10% of both students and staff in Coventry come from the EU. The government says it wants diversity to continue. However, this is not backed up by the failure to mention Erasmus scheme in the deal. The EU also contributes to a huge amount to Coventry through funding beyond that given to the universities. This funding, which is yet to be protected and guaranteed for the long term after Brexit. According to the House of Commons Library, Coventry has received over 400 million in funding from the EU since 2014. This money is a crucial part of the local economy, keeping thousands of people employed. Unfortunately, we all know there is no chance of the government maintaining this funding as well as increasing funding for the NHS. The Prime Minister may pretend there will be a Brexit bonanza, but a Brexit will not fill the gap left by the EU funding, leaving Coventry worse off. The Prime Minister has made numerous vague promises of extra funding for the NHS after Brexit, but this relies entirely upon us starting new trade deals immediately after the transition period. These deals will not be easy, despite promises to have 40 of these deals ready by March. And so, without any definitive evidence of extra funding, the Prime Minister's warm words on the NHS may as well be written on the side of a bus. As well as threatening the jobs of my constituents and their public services, it also threatens their rights at work. It would mean that any new workers' rights protection of the EU that will be enacted after the transition period will not apply in the UK. It would also mean that if we fell into the backstop an agreement which we cannot leave unilaterally, it would freeze workers' rights. It would leave UK workers and trade unions unable to take complaints to the EU Court of Justice, despite the court's responsibility for this. The Tory right want to cut back on workers' rights in their ideological vision of Brexit Britain, and this deal makes it far too easy for this to happen.
Thank you very much indeed. Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, I approach this debate out of a sense more of disappointment, in the same way as I did when I decided to campaign for and vote for Brexit, not out of some ideological phobia of the EU, but because of a belief that the EU was going backwards, that the UK's interests were diverging from it, and without reform it was doomed to steady but terminal decline. That reform was not forthcoming. But I don't want to repeat here the debates we had in the run-up to the referendum, as I fear many honourable members have in recent weeks, and indeed in this debate. This is about the deal now before us. We voted to leave on June the 23rd, 2016, as did my constituency. The government pledged to implement what you decide in their little booklet costing £9.3 million. And in the 2017 election, the two main parties secured 82% of the vote, both pledged to implement the referendum result. The people have not given us any alternative instruction since. Our manifestos have not been rewritten since. Indeed, the campaign to sideline the referendum result has been marked by two, I think, disingenuous approaches. Firstly, that it's just all become a bit too complicated, so shouldn't we just call the whole thing off? And secondly, a constant embellishment of the horrors of post-Brexit economic forecasts, which have duly encouraged Remain voters to believe that the result could be reversed, and encouraged EU negotiators to believe that as well, and therefore it makes any terms for our departure doubly unpalatable. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've discussed with my constituents my view on this. Now, over 1,000 of them have written to me, urging me to vote against this deal. In contrast, only a few dozen have urged me to support it. So today I should be welcoming a meaningful vote for a proposal that delivers the Brexit that I campaigned for and my constituents in the country voted for. But alas, I cannot do that, because this proposal does not deliver Brexit. Its unprecedented terms, I will in just a minute, its unprecedented terms have the potential to undermine our sovereignty and the union of the United Kingdom like nothing before, and I'm deeply worried for the future of Brexit after the absolutely shambolic way the whole issue has been handled by the government in recent days. I'll give way.
Thanks, my honourable friend, for giving way. I have just a simple question for him and others who face difficulty in voting for this deal, and it's this. If we don't vote for the deal, what will happen to the rights of United Kingdom nationals living in the EU 27 from the 29th of March?
Well, that is up to the government to negotiate. And given the government has failed to produce an immigration white paper that we've been waiting for some time, then it really does need to get on with answering questions like that and give some uncertainty. Many honourable members have quoted metaphors for our present predicament. Well, let me add another one to the mix. It's like buying a house, but you've only seen it from the outside. You're handing over the full asking price at the outset up front. You sign all the legal transaction documents without even agreeing on the fixtures, fittings and completion date, or indeed knowing whether immigration status of your family allows you actually to live there. And only then after that, commissioning a survey, the results of which you do not share with your family, despite eventually finding out that the neighbours have an unlimited right-of-way access across your garden and unfettered access to your garden pond, and no indication of when you're actually going to be able to move in. Who in their right mind, Mr. Speaker, would agree a deal on buying a house, let alone on such an important issue as the future constitutional basis of our whole country? Now, I thought the member for East Surrey, in an excellent speech, and he's welcome back to the back benches if he's going to make speeches like that, described this as a deal in name only, and it's another case of difficult decisions being kicked into the long grass. Because above all, Mr. Speaker, what we need now, and frankly have needed for some time, is certainty. Certainty for our citizens, certainty for our businesses and our investors, certainty for our fishermen, our farmers, and many more. And yet the political agreement that accompanies this document sounds good, but is littered with conditional phrases like agree to develop, intend to consider, will explore the possibility, and use their best endeavours. That is not something concrete enough that I feel I can sign up to. And my biggest fear is that this deal only extends that uncertainty. Uncertainty over, as now confirmed by the Attorney General's advice, as to how long we will continue to be rule takers for our tariffs, for our regulations, for our alignment requirements, for our competition laws, our trade deals, and uncertainty over the integrity of our whole United Kingdom and our sovereignty. And on the subject of Northern Ireland, the EU has spent the last 2 years declining to agree a practical arrangement for the border, despite facing the real and present danger of it ending in a no-deal Brexit, which would see no handover of £39 million and serious disorder that a no-deal could bring in the short term at least. So what I don't understand, Mr. Speaker, is why on earth does the Prime Minister think that the EU will agree to a solution to this, I think, much overhyped and largely fabricated problem of Northern Ireland in the next 2 years, when the cheque will have been signed and a legally binding framework deal agreed? What leverage will we have left to secure mutually beneficial terms of all the outstanding issues to be resolved to avoid an interminable backstop? And there are many issues still to be resolved. It is unthinkable that we should sign a deal which compromises our sovereignty and the ability of this House and this government, answerable to our peoples, indefinitely to set our own laws.
Will he give way?
I will indeed.
I think he's making a very powerful case. And does he agree with me that the perverseness of this is that this is putting us in a worse position than the existing status quo?
Well, I'm afraid my right honourable friend is right. There are some advantages to the position we're in now, which we sign away in this never-ending backstop transition waiting room phase that we are going to be stuck in. So for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, that is why I cannot support a deal that has an open-ended backstop at its heart. We need a clean global Brexit on terms that both partners can confidently plot our future beyond 2020 to our mutual benefit. No more kicking into the long grass, no more avoiding taking difficult decisions. It doesn't make that decision any easier by having endless transitions and further discussions and negotiations lasting years and years and years. We have got to grasp the reality. But where is the crack team of the best brains across the United Kingdom and the EU working on credible, practical, technological-based solutions for the Northern Ireland-Irish border, for example? Surely that should have been our biggest priority for some time if the backstop hinged on it. Yet I don't think I'm alone in looking in vain for any sense of urgency here. To those who have come up with no practical solutions for a workable Brexit deal, despite having stood on a Conservative or Labour manifesto at the last election that pledged to deliver Brexit, those people should stop kidding themselves and stop conning the British public that everything will be magically resolved by a second referendum. If it were to come up with a different result to the first referendum, why should 17.4 million people who voted in good faith, many for the first time ever, accept the results? If it were to come up with the same result, how much more time will be wasted? How many more resources will be wasted and further damaging delays caused? And given the huge divisions resulting from the first referendum, how does repeating that bruising experience do anything to help bringing the country back together again? Surely our current travails would be exacerbated even further if that were possible. So, Mr. Speaker, for me, there's only one alternative: resoundingly rejecting this framework deal in front of this House we vote in next Tuesday. It will send out a strong message to the European Union that whilst there's much in the agreement that we can sign up to and much that can be negotiated in the actual subsequent negotiations, an unbridled, non-time limited backstop makes it completely unworkable. And if the EU are serious about achieving a mutually beneficial relationship, they must acknowledge that, re-engage accordingly, and come up with more realistic terms that this House then can show a lead in agreeing to and determining our future and bringing back some degree of certainty that everyone is screaming out for.
Vera Hobhouse.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2016, the country voted by a narrow majority to leave the European Union. The Prime Minister is offering us a deal and says we should vote for it because it delivers the will of the narrow majority. She also threatens us with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit with all the truly damaging consequences for our economy and for people's livelihoods. So what is my duty as an MP to resolve this matter in the light of the 2016 referendum? Do I have to vote for any Brexit that is put in front of me? The duty of an MP is in our representative democracy to listen to the people and respect their views, and to use our own judgment of what is the best for our constituents or the country. And to keep this balance is at the heart of the matter in front of us. Nobody can deny that the referendum happened and the result it produced. In the last 2 years, we have been confronted with many worrying reports of how the Leave campaign manipulated the campaign in an improper way, and we should be deeply concerned about the threats to our democracy that this kind of manipulation poses. However, the result has not been nullified, and the government had a duty to find a Brexit that is good for the country. So I look at the deal in front of us and asked 2 questions. Does this deal result in us leaving the EU? It does. Does it protect the long-term interests of our country? It does not. Why should I vote for it if I truly believe that it is not in the interest of my constituents or the country? I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady and my near neighbour for giving way. If we are to leave the European Union, does she believe that the Liberal Democrats should campaign thereafter to rejoin the European Union?
We are currently in front of a deal that's been put in front of us, and I'm looking whether this is in the best interest of the country. The Prime Minister has refused to work with Parliament to find a consensus. She rushed off and drew up her red lines, which made it impossible to find reasonable alternatives, and she now tries to bully Parliament into forgetting what is good for the country. She tries to make us think that our only duty is to vote for her deal and deliver a Brexit of any form. If government had won the argument and a good Brexit was possible, this would be a very different debate. But if no particular deal put to Parliament is a good deal compared to EU membership, what should Parliament do? Should we vote for this deal just because it's here? Should we vote for it because it's not as bad as crashing out? No, we should not. Because we would violate a deep principle, a duty that every MP cannot escape from, and that is to use our own informed judgment. I encourage my colleagues from across the House to look into their hearts and ask themselves, is this deal what is best for the country? The Prime Minister is using a different argument. She says we have to leave the EU even if it's bad for the country because the people voted for it. She suggests that the dutiful thing for MPs in light of the referendum is to vote for something even if we believe it's not good for this country. But that would make a nonsense of our representative democracy. I have been elected as an MP to employ my own informed judgment when voting. I've never yet seen a proposal for a good Brexit. In every aspect, it has become plain to see that leaving the EU is making us economically poorer, less influential, and less able to control our own destiny. Even the government has given up telling us that this deal offers anything better than EU membership. All the government does is reiterate that it delivers the will of the people. But no MP should be obliged to vote for something they don't believe is good, or at least not worse than what we have. On the contrary, we have a duty to do the opposite. Does this mean we defy the will of the people? No. We can legitimately reject any particular Brexit deal in accordance with our own informed judgment. But Parliament cannot move from there and cancel Brexit. This House cannot call off Brexit. Only the people can, and that is the true meaning of the referendum result in 2016. When Parliament decides that no Brexit deal is good enough, then Parliament is stuck. At this point, the decision has to go back to the people. This is how our democracy works. It balances our representative democracy with the fact that we had a referendum. Our representative democracy does not demand that MPs surrender their judgment. This Parliament has spent the last 2 years trying to find a Brexit that is good for the country. If no such Brexit can be found that commands a majority in this House, MPs must agree to go back to the people. Mr. Speaker, in my judgment, this deal is not good for the country. It would be a catastrophic mistake, and I will vote against it. And as I said many times in this place before, I believe the only way forward is a people's vote.
Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This country voted for Brexit, and I believe it is incumbent on this House and this government to deliver just that. And the people that voted for Brexit didn't vote for something they didn't understand. They voted for a land of opportunity, for freedom, freedom over our laws, freedom over our borders, and the ability to trade freely, which, as members of the EU, we cannot do. And today, and over the next couple of days, we're asked to look at a withdrawal agreement and a political declaration. That withdrawal agreement, amazingly, has everything the EU wants in it, and that would be binding. The political declaration, which looks at the future trading agreement and future relationship, that's what we in the UK want. And guess what? That's not binding. For me, in the West Country, the impact on my fishing industry would be devastating. There is a clear link intended between our ability to fish and reaching some form of economic deal. So, to vote for this would be not only damaging to my fishermen, but damaging for the country as a whole, and most importantly, it would not, in any shape, size or form, deliver Brexit. This, it seems to me, is a triumph of hope over experience. Our experience of the EU is generally, this is what we want, and you can have as many goes as you like looking at it, but it's that and nothing else. We will not move. If we take this vote and we put through this agreement, we will remain a rule taker from the ECJ on environmental matters, employment matters. Indeed, even the withdrawal agreement will ultimately be determined, should there be dispute, by the ECJ. We will, as been discussed already, have absolutely no right to unilaterally leave. And indeed, we've all now seen the Attorney General's legal advice. I don't really need to say more, do I? We will be unable to pursue independent trade deals. It's not that it says we can't. It's that because we are bound to following strict equivalence with the EU in many areas of legislation, we are very unattractive, as indeed the Americans have already said. If we stick to their rule book, we cannot do what you normally do in a trade deal, which is agree both tariffs and the methods of rule and regulation to look at an equivalent outcome across both countries. The backstop, as we've heard very emotionally, threatens the integrity of the UK and would potentially put a border down the Irish Sea. That is not acceptable. That breaks the Union. And that extension period will continue the uncertainty for business, not bring it to an end, as many seem to think it will. And the amendments which have been laid, and quite a number have been laid, will not improve matters. When I look at them, what do? Well, they have a go at sorting out the backstop. They try to remove it, or they try to time limit it. But as I've said, that's not the only problem with this agreement. So it seems to me that's not going to work. There is also some provision which would require us to go for a further vote, another referendum. And I'm afraid I have to disagree with the previous speaker. The people have spoken. We must accept that. It is not for us to say to the people, try again and get a result that the EU wants. That's simply not acceptable. The amendments raised by the opposition would keep us in a customs union, one which would absolutely disempower us from doing any trade deals. And worst of all, none of these amendments are going to stop us paying 39 billion, and according to the ONS, it's no longer 39 billion, it's actually 46. And if we extend our relationship, potentially for a very long time, then we still continue paying annual payments. And we will be asked next Tuesday to take a meaningful vote. And those who think that by supporting this agreement are doing the only thing they can to deliver Brexit, think again. That is absolutely not right. There is another option. I wish there were others, but at this point in time, there is no time. The 29th of March is almost upon us. And that is, no, I'll continue, and that is,
I'm grateful to the, my honourable friend. I pose the same question as I did to my other honourable friend, which is simply this. She has said there's simply not enough time. What rights will UK nationals rely on the 29th of March 2019, 1 million of whom reside in the EU 27?
You've asked, the honourable member has asked a very sensible question, to which I will give him an answer. I'm afraid I reject the description of what will happen as a crashing out, a falling over the precipice. We will go out on a WTO, World Trade Organization deal, and that is going to be something which is very much to our benefit. 98% of trade that we do is actually on WTO arrangements. So I do not agree either the government is not prepared, because it is. I've listened to proposals from most of the government departments in this House, and I do not agree that suddenly there is going to be chaos. Yes, I do not dispute there will be a bumpy ride, but we are prepared, and I can tell you, having worked with the evidence that I've seen coming to the Public Accounts Committee, those on the other side in Calais are no more in favour of chaos than we are in Dover. So please, no I won't. No I won't.
Why not? You get another minute.
No, she's already had
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Just 2 points. She says WTO, but if I understand correctly, therefore, she expects to get a whole series of deals from the EU around WTO, because otherwise she hasn't answered the question of our honourable friend. And secondly, she's also, I assume, believes that the Belfast Agreement should simply be ripped up and disregarded and reneged upon by the UK government.
As one lawyer to another lawyer, for the right honourable member for Beaconsfield, I would say to him he has actually misrepresented the way that WTO. It does not require lots of other deals. What it does is it takes us out and it enables us to look at all sorts of options. We could then move into a Canada-style free trade agreement. There are many things that we could do, and I would like, with the honourable member, to take issue with the amendment that he put to the House yesterday. I think many are thinking that really would put us in a position where, at the end of the day, this House would be empowered to say, OK, if you don't like this withdrawal agreement, then this House has the power to stop us going out, as he would say, on no deal. And as I've said, there is no such thing as no deal. And as a matter of law, as lawyer to lawyer, as I understand it, the power of that motion cannot bind this House and cannot stop Article 50 triggering on the 29th of March. So those who are thinking of supporting this arrangement put forward by the Prime Minister, because that's the only way, I would say to them, think again. That is not Brexit, and actually there is another way. And rather than buying time, extending uncertainty, we go out WTO and then we are free to trade and free to get the sort of deal that this country absolutely needs and deserves. Thank you.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't elected to this place to make my constituents poorer or less safe. And I don't believe anyone here from any party came into politics to do that. But if we vote for this deal, we are doing just that. The evidence is now very clear. Leaving the European Union will make us poorer. Poorer as an economy, as a country, and as a society. It puts people's livelihoods at risk and the future of our children at jeopardy. And I will be voting against this deal.
Hear, hear.
And for me, this is also deeply personal. I've studied in France and Spain. I've worked in Brussels and Madrid. I speak French and Spanish, and I call myself a citizen of both Wales and Europe. I'm proud of the European Union, bringing countries together in unity and in peace. And members may disagree with me, and that is their right, but whoever says that we must leave the EU because of a vote that was taken 2.5 years ago is mistaken. The splits and divisions that we see across society are not going away. Extremists are waiting to expose the differences we see in our politics today, and our actions and our words will scar Britain for decades to come. Now is the time for leadership, to be brave, to stand up for what's right, not blindly follow the path set out by previous governments and administrations. We were elected to do the right thing by our constituents. Those hard-working families and people who depend on jobs that a stable and flourishing economy provides, who depend on well-run and efficient public services, high-performing schools, universities and hospitals. And being a full EU member keeps us safe from terrorism and safe from international crime. It keeps us in those crucial networks that our Prime Minister fought to keep us a part of when she was Home Secretary, and which she cannot now guarantee. And in this House, we've also heard a lot of nonsense, repetition and bluster. Many members opposite, using the issue for their own ends, such as the member for Wokingham. Ego-driven, nostalgic for a past empire, an imperial nation. A dangerous attitude from members ignorant of this nation's history. And Brexit has dominated everything here. That's because it is the single biggest issue facing us since the Second World War, and will have repercussions for many, many years to come. But we know other business, important business, is being sidelined because of this. Yep. This week and next week, we're seeing world leaders come together in Katowice in Poland to decide how to tackle climate change, the single biggest issue facing us in the world and our future place in the world. But you wouldn't know it here. This place is embroiled in an act of immense self-harm, Brexit. The UK should be leading the way in climate action, but instead it's tangled itself here in untruths and falsehoods about Brexit. And we've heard many of those untruths in the last 2 years. We've heard that getting a good deal would be the easiest thing ever. We heard that we hold all the cards in the negotiations. And we also heard that there would be £350 million a week for the NHS. And now we're hearing another lie. We should back the Prime Minister's blindfold, lose-lose deal, or we plummet off the cliff edge with a no-deal Brexit. We know that's a false choice. This blindfold Brexit deal is a fantasy. Major decisions are postponed, leaving us forever negotiating our future relationship with the EU. We also know that there's no Brexit deal that can meet all the promises that have been made. The real choice now is whether we go ahead with this blindfold fantasy or actually stick with the deal, the best deal that we already have as EU members. So there is still time to change the course of that, to do the right thing. Many people are coming up to me in my constituency of Cardiff North, asking me to put a stop to this madness. Many of those people actually voted leave 2 years ago, and they're changing their minds. Businesses and people are frantic with worry. And the only reason we know that the Prime Minister does have a half-hearted support for this deal with businesses is that it gives a few years of transition for those businesses to plan their move out of this country. Exactly. And this is the very real risk with this so-called deal. It leaves absolutely everything unresolved. Indefinite uncertainty. This is not what people want. Democracy means that it is only the people that can sort this out. So that's why we must ask them. We must ask them with a people's vote on the final deal. Thank you.
Zach Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker, it's often said, and it's been said today, particularly by strong Remainers, that we can't possibly know how each of the 17.4 million or so people voted for Brexit. And that is obviously true. There are any number of reasons why people voted for Brexit. But I think that we can be confident, not least from the debate we're having today, that very few of those people did so in the hope that we'd end up with a deal that looked like the one we're debating today. In a legalistic sense, the withdrawal agreement removes us from the EU. But for all intents and purposes, its effect is to bind us to the rules of the EU while removing our ability to influence those rules. I'm not going to focus specifically on the transition period today. It's certainly true, incidentally, that the EU is given vast, possibly unprecedented powers over the UK during that time, and it is certainly uncomfortable, but it also could well be necessary. The issue is what happens after the transition period. It is possible also that during that transition period we will be able to agree a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and as a consequence we may be able to avoid the backstop. But I think that seems incredibly unlikely. The backstop effectively keeps us in the customs union. It subjects us to EU rules with no UK say at all in framing those rules. We've heard today from numerous speakers it would divide Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. It would prevent us from striking meaningful new free trade agreements with other countries. The Attorney General a couple of days ago gave a magnificent performance in Parliament in which he described it in 3 sentences, but as undesirable, unattractive, unsatisfactory. But the biggest concern about the backstop is that we cannot leave it without the permission of the EU, and that is not disputed. The question then is, what incentive is there for the EU to negotiate in good faith? What would stop that backstop becoming a trap, becoming a long-term basis of the UK-EU relationship? Given that any EU country can veto our departure from the backstop, the likelihood of being stuck in that backstop is surely very high indeed. We'd have to wait until each and every EU country had its fill before agreeing finally to let us out. Yes, we could leave the backstop. We heard again and again, if we can prove that the EU is not acting in good faith. But what on earth, in practical terms, does that even mean? The withdrawal agreement has united Leavers and Remainers in an extraordinary manner. I shared a platform a few weeks ago with the Right Honourable Member for Twickenham, my neighbour, a few weeks ago, and it was the first time in 2 years that we agreed on something relating to the EU. We've known, I think, for some time now that this deal has virtually no chance of making it through Parliament. We know that it jeopardises this party's relationship with the DUP, which is critically important to keeping the government going. So it is odd, I think, that the government continues to so vehemently flog what is so obviously a dead horse. Now, I don't agree that the choice is between this deal or no Brexit. And I don't agree with those people who gleefully hold up this deal that we're debating today as proof somehow that Brexit was impossible or a fantasy. All it really proves is that those in charge of conducting the negotiations have not succeeded. Mostly, they have not succeeded because they're people who are miserable about the referendum result and treated the exercise as a disaster management. They set out looking at all the risks of Brexit. Of course there are risks in a transition of this sort, but they failed, I think, to look for the opportunities as well. We're one of the biggest economies in the world. We're geographically placed well to continue playing a big role in world affairs. Our language is the global language. Our judiciary is trusted. Despite all the rubbish that's going on at the moment, our democracy remains the envy of the world. Our legal system provides more certainty and clarity than pretty much anywhere else in the world, and people want to live and work and raise families here. Had we never joined the EU in the first place, does anyone honestly believe that they would not be biting off a hand to agree a comprehensive free trade agreement today? Of course they would. And there is still time to bring forward the option which Brussels was always expecting and which makes the most sense for the world's fifth largest economy: the foundations of comprehensive free trade agreement based on mutual respect and mutual recognition. Now, I know there are many in this House who share my views about the deal, but whose answer is to press for a second referendum. I think that would be madness. There was a consensus at the time of the referendum that the outcome would be honoured. Solemn promises from the Prime Minister echoed right across the House. We can all remember at the time some people brashly saying it didn't matter how people voted, the EU would never let us out anyway. And I remember those people being dismissed as if they were lunatics. But that did, after all, happen. It happened in Denmark, it happened in France, it happened in Netherlands, I think it happened twice in Ireland. I was one of the people, incidentally, who dismissed those concerns as conspiracy theories. How extraordinary, how depressing that there is now a real chance that those people could have been right all along. Now, I understand that some people remain mortified by the outcome of the vote. And of course this place is filled with extremely clever people who could potentially find a clever way of stopping Brexit one way or the other. But it would demonstrate a remarkable lack of wisdom. For failure to honour the referendum would surely cause an irreparable breakdown in the relationship between people and the authorities. It would usher in a new era of extreme politics. There is no reason why the UK should be immune from the trends that are plaguing almost every other country in Europe. France, where Le Pen leads in the polls. Germany, where AfD, founded only in 2013, is now the second biggest party. Austria, where the Freedom Party is part of the government. Italy, Spain, Sweden, Greece, and so on. If that gut fear that so many people have, the feeling that the political elite simply cannot be trusted, is utterly and completely confirmed, where will those mainstream voters go? It is madness. You could justify it possibly, potentially, perhaps, if something truly seismic has happened. But it hasn't. Millions of pounds have been poured into a campaign to undermine the referendum, make people fear every aspect of Brexit. The polls have barely moved. They're still within the margin of error. I believe the government is going to lose this vote next week. I hope, I'm afraid to say, that the government loses the vote next week. And then either this Prime Minister, or if she will not do it, another Prime Minister, must take it back to the EU and change it.
West. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Richmond Park, who I know prizes the environment very highly, though he didn't mention it in his speech, because perhaps it might not have gone according to his argument for today being a lever. But anyway, the language, Mr. Speaker, that's been used in recent days by the Prime Minister herself has further poisoned the... He'd like to give way on the environment.
Much very kind words. She's absolutely right, but I have given 3 lengthy speeches about why Brexit, if done properly, would be a boon, a great thing for the environment, if done properly.
West.
I beg to disagree, but I do mention the environment later in my few-minute speech. But it is a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Richmond Park. And one of the things I wanted to begin with, Mr. Speaker, was just to talk about the language that we've been using in the recent days. And the particular term that I think has caused quite a lot of feelings of concern within my constituency is this term queue jumpers. And I was very pleased to hear that the Prime Minister did actually apologise for that in the House the day before yesterday. We know that so many EU citizens who do live in my constituency have been worried by that. And myself and the member for Tottenham do share the borough of Haringey, where 42,000 EU citizens are resident. They're friends, colleagues, NHS workers, neighbours, and a valued part of our diverse community. I think it's very important that we don't forget in this House the importance of having that respectful debate despite our differences of opinion and views. Mr. Speaker, very briefly, the economy obviously has to be mentioned in relation to this deal, because we know that many have warned about the danger of this deal, and in particular we know that the Governor of the Bank of England has said that all of the assessments identify significant negative outcomes for the economy, resulting in hard-working families facing food price hikes of 10%, businesses facing increased friction when trading, and the country as a whole facing yet another recession. And, Mr. Speaker, I do find it difficult to know that anybody could vote for a deal which could possibly lead to another recession, bearing in mind that we haven't really recovered from the first recession in 2008 following the global financial crash. Equally, with no firm or clear commitments around participation, for example, in some of the Europol, Eurojust, several concerns around security arrangements which were highlighted not just by the Honourable Member for Hackney when she stood up, but by others. We know that human trafficking, international crime, drug smuggling, terrorism and illegal immigration are all issues which are most effectively tackled through deep and integrated international cooperation, but in particular, logically, with our closest neighbours. Briefly, Mr. Speaker, on the question of geopolitics, merely a few weeks ago we marked the centenary of the armistice. I don't think it's stretching things too far to bring it into this debate to say that just how moving it was to see the German President lay a wreath at the cenotaph. The reminder of the importance of internationalism and the specific role that the EU has played in maintaining peace across the continent and promoting that ideal worldwide. We know, and we speak about NATO, defence and security over and over again in this chamber, but we all know that it's the people-to-people contact, it's the country-to-country contact, it's the Erasmus students, it's the internationalism which underpins that security and which makes that relationship meaningful. At a time when the liberal order is once again under threat, with the rise of an expansionist Russia, a volatile American foreign policy, and with the far right, as the Honourable Member for Richmond Park mentioned, once again on the march on the streets of Europe, now is not the time to distance ourselves from our European friends. It's abundantly clear that this deal cannot command a majority in this House for the reasons I've set out, as well as others. Likewise, we all know that the destination of no deal will not be accepted by a majority of honourable members, and it's really pleasing to see that regardless of which side of the EU referendum debate one is on, so many members today have said that no deal would be an act of vandalism. So where does that leave us? Like many honourable members across the House, I've continued to make the case for a second vote, because the member for Richmond Park's quite right to say we must respect the result of the referendum, and we mustn't be patronising about why people voted the way that they did. And in the same way, once the democracy switch is flicked, the only way of unflicking that is to flick it off. And also, just to pick up another point earlier in the debate, the member for Totnes, I thought, made a very valuable contribution. You need a hip replacement, you go and see the surgeon, and in consenting to the operation, you then know exactly what it is that you're getting. This would be a secondary, meaningful vote for people to really enable members of this Parliament to help to make us that decision. I think, Mr. Speaker, it would be completely different if we had a Parliament where there was an overwhelming majority. It was clear as a bell. But I think given the result being so close in June 2016, and given the fact that we are living in such unusual times here in the House of Commons, it is important that the people do assist us in making this crucial decision. I also welcome the fact, both from our Shadow Chancellor and the Shadow Brexit Secretary, that this position of the second vote has not been taken off the table. And I look forward to future progress on that particular position. On multiple occasions, of course, the Prime Minister has refused to consider the option on the basis that the decision was made in 2016. But I think nothing ever stands still in politics, and it's very important as we go forward, as we see that each week we're losing 500 million from our economy, that we do need to be a little more decisive, provide the opportunity quite quickly to have this second vote and then be able to put it to bed so that we can focus on those other key issues around the NHS, schools funding, universal credit, all the things which we know our constituents want us to get a wriggle on with. To sum up now, Mr. Speaker, I recognise the result of the referendum. I have serious concerns about the way that Vote Leave ran the campaign, and I mentioned that when I did my intervention with the member from the Ribble Valley, just to clarify and use a couple of my seconds to just emphasise that the illegitimate use of social media, which now is being looked into by our Select Committee, the questionable use of political donations, and also the question marks over whether some of the funds which were used may have come from abroad. These are all crucial to our democracy. Each time we have a democratic exercise, we learn more from it. And it's very crucial that if we do have a further question with the public on this, that we get it right, we maintain a positive tone, and we ensure that we have the best standards of democracy. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing other contributions and do hope that we eventually do get that second vote.
Thank you. Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This will surprise you. I'm old enough to have voted in the 1975 referendum. And I voted yes to stay in the common market. But what I voted for changed rather substantially over the years, and I became somewhat concerned about the way the EU had developed. And when it came to the last referendum, I was Vote Leave. On balance, but I think that was the right decision. And I think the truth of the matter is it wasn't to do with what was on the side of a bus. It's that most of our citizens actually have had to live with the EU over a number of decades. And there's just that general feeling that actually it wasn't very responsive to their needs, and that the British people have a certain native common sense, and that is that actually we could do better on our own. And compared with the 1970s, when Britain was a rather depressing place, Britain actually is doing really well in the world and has been doing so over the past 20 years.
1971.
And the reality, therefore, is I think that the British people, it was a vote of confidence in this country. We can do a lot better. We can be an open, flexible, dynamic economy in the world. And leaving the EU was always going to be a messy business, because any kind of divorce is. And there are compromises, and I pay credit to the Prime Minister for the work that she and the negotiators have done. It is a difficult job, and probably a thankless job, and it will be even more thankless next Tuesday when we have the result of what this House will decide. And I think there are some good things in the agreement, and I think that a lot of it I could agree with as a compromise to see us out of the EU. But there's something which I find very difficult to deal with as a Conservative Unionist. That's the Irish backstop. I don't want to treat any area of the United Kingdom differently to my constituency. I think that there is a danger of getting us hung up in that arrangement. I think the advice of the Attorney General was very clear. And I think the Prime Minister needs to go back to the EU and say, deal on, providing we have a date to the backstop. And if there's a date, then I think a lot of the fears of people about getting hung up and not being able to do deals would disappear. And we've already heard that there's no intent on either north or south of the border to establish a hard border. And my fear is that the backstop will be used as a device through the negotiations for trade and for negotiations over fish as we already heard from President Macron, that it be used to screw the British down and give us a bad deal.
Would my honourable
Of
friend
course.
give way? I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way. Given that he supported the common market, does he accept that there may be an alternative, like an EEA-EFTA style deal, that would give back the fisheries, that would remove the need for the backstop and provide the kind of reassurance that he seeks?
It wouldn't be my favourite choice, but it may well be a choice the House may have to consider if we end up next year. The reality is, I hope that we can finesse the current agreement. Ultimately, I think the EU have to accept that the backstop is unacceptable to Parliament, and if they accept that, then I think actually there's a fairly good chance the deal would go through. And I think the deal actually, without the backstop, might be rather better than the EFTA proposals. So we will have to see how the Prime Minister does. It is not unheard of when there have been toing and froing between member governments of the EU, referendums, agreements, sometimes governments to go back to the EU and say, our people won't wear it, think again. And I think it would only take some very modest changes in order to get the deal done. And I hope that the Prime Minister listens to what the House will say next Tuesday. I'm afraid I will be voting against the deal in its current form, but I would be receptive to modification of the backstop, and then I hope we'd be in a position where we could actually move on. I'm unhappy about voting against my government. I've been a Member of Parliament over 20 years. I've voted against since we've been in government in 2010, I've voted against the government once. This will be the second time. I hope I never have to do it again, because I believe politics is a team game, and I want my team to win, and I want the Prime Minister to do the best for our nation. But unfortunately, I am a Conservative Unionist, and the backstop is something which I cannot accept.
Thank you. Ellie Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There can be no doubt that this is a defining moment in our history. Our global economic and political success is at stake. I represent a constituency that voted overwhelmingly to remain part of the European Union, and I stand here today to make this speech on their behalf. Whilst the European Union is not perfect, it is a union that has helped to bring so much peace and prosperity to our nation and to our continent. To dismiss our 45 years of membership diminishes what we have collectively achieved and what is possible. Turning to the theme of today's debate, we should not forget the benefits that EU membership has brought the country through immigration. Would our economy or our NHS thrive without it? Of course not. In England, 63,000 NHS staff are EU nationals. 1/3 of these staff work in London, and across the capital, almost half of the home building workforce is from the EU. Yet over the course of the referendum and subsequent negotiations, I've become frequently saddened that talk of freedom of movement has become a political football used only in negative terms. A few weeks ago, I was speaking at a public meeting in my constituency, and a constituent, an EU national, stood up and told me she'd made her life here and was now fearing that she was no longer welcome in this country. I assured her that she was welcome, and that, like many others, I am immensely proud of our multicultural community in South East London, but the government has provided nothing but uncertainty on this. It is irrefutable that immigration has aided our nation and our continent. We should be proud of what it has contributed and what it has helped us to achieve. From my own personal experience, as a teenager, I was given the opportunity to live and study in Italy through the European Union's Leonardo da Vinci programme. Growing up in South East London and attending my local school, the idea of being offered at age 18 the chance to temporarily move to Italy was almost incomprehensible. It was a completely life-changing experience, and I consider myself to be a citizen of the European Union. I want my son and all young people to have the same opportunities as I have had to live, work and travel freely within the EU. Instead, young people will be denied the chances of upward social mobility and coexisting with our European partners, compounded with uncertain future of potential economic gloom as a result of this poorly negotiated deal. When the Withdrawal Act was before this House this time last year, I brought forward an amendment highlighting the work Europe has done around family-friendly employment rights and gender equality. If my amendment, which lost by 14 votes, had passed, it would have ensured Parliament is kept informed of changes in European law to make sure that we kept pace and not fall behind on the equalities agenda. Rights in the workplace have been fought long and hard for, and a large part of our current employment rights on the statute book come from Europe. Rules around paid holiday, working hours, pregnancy and maternity rights, TUPE and age discrimination, to name but a few. Sadly, there are some on the benches opposite who wouldn't think twice about tearing these up, and without the safeguards of the EU, the workplace risks becoming even more precarious and insecure. Mr. Speaker, I respect the outcome of the 2016 referendum, but nobody in this House can argue that things have not changed in that time. The political landscape has changed, the economic landscape has changed, public opinion has changed. All the while, the government is trying to force through answers to questions that were not on the ballot paper in 2016 and expect constituents to blindly follow too. When I was elected to Parliament, I vowed to my constituents that I would not support any form of Brexit that would be detrimental to them. London voted overwhelmingly to remain part of the European Union, and in Lewisham Western Penge, this was by a factor of 2 to 1. As their representative and voice in this place, it is primarily the futures of my constituents that I consider when casting my vote on this motion. This terrible deal would result in a miserable Brexit for the UK, threatening business confidence, jobs, our NHS and the future of young people. The biggest issues will remain unresolved while we follow rules over which we will no longer have any influence. I say to the government benches that from start to finish these negotiations have been flawed, and the results of this catastrophic approach are apparent for all to see. With time still left before the end of March, this doesn't have to be a binary choice between the government's deal or no deal. Mr. Speaker, I don't believe anyone voted in the referendum to be worse off or less secure. The people should be given a voice again. They should be empowered to decide whether they want their future to be carved out by the Prime Minister's deal, which even her own MPs can't unite on, or whether they want an alternative. Given the shambles of the deal which is before us now, it is surely now time, Mr. Speaker, for the decision to go back to the public with a people's vote with an option to remain in the EU. With so much at stake, our prosperity, our success, our security, it is only right that we return the decision to the people and give them their say once more.
Steve Double.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it is a great privilege to be able to speak in this very important debate, and it is an honour to follow the Honourable Lady from Lewisham Western Penge. And although we come at this from very different perspectives, I do respect her passion in speaking up for her constituency. The people of Cornwall have a long history of being a little bit awkward, a little bit independently minded, even occasionally a little bit rebellious. There is the famous time when 20,000 Cornishmen marched on this place because the King had put one of our bishops in the Tower. And even since way back then, the Cornish have had a slightly sort of awkward relationship with authority. And therefore it was no surprise whatsoever to me when Cornwall voted to leave the EU in 2016. And the constituency that I have the privilege of representing, St Austell and Newquay, actually had the biggest leave vote in the whole of Cornwall. But I think it's important we recognise that that vote was not just about our relationship with the European Union. It was about much more than that. Much of it was from people who felt disconnected, felt neglected, often felt ignored by what we might term the establishment. And thousands who had never voted before in any election voted to leave despite Project Fear and being told continually that this would be terrible for them. They voted courageously for us to leave the European Union because they wanted their voice heard, they wanted to know that their vote mattered. And I believe that's part of the challenge before this House today and in the coming weeks. Because this is no longer just about Brexit. This is about the heart of our democracy. This is about who runs this country, and are we truly a democracy where the will of the people prevails? And are we people in this House who will listen to those that vote for us and send us here and implement the decision that they have made? A constituent of mine yesterday pointed out that on the 22nd of June 2016, he wrote this and posted it on Facebook. He said, "The day has finally come Tomorrow is EU referendum day, where we all get to vote on a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to decide whether or not we are in or out of the EU. I'm not going to persuade anyone either way. I don't think it will make a difference what the result is. We aren't leaving Europe ever. And no vote of the people is going to change that. There are far too many higher powers with vested interest in the status quo to let a silly thing like democracy get in the way. He went on to say that if the vote was to leave, higher powers will set into motion a series of events that will prevent leaving ever happening, because it has to be approved through Parliament. Then we will have white papers, debates, amendments, more debates, more amendments, and plenty more political posture on either side. It won't get settled in the next 3 years, and then it will become an issue for the next general election, and by then we would have served another 4 years under Europe, so what would be the point of leaving now? Now, I don't know if he was Mystic Meg or a prophet, but there is a great fear among many, many people that what he described all that time ago is exactly what is happening. That there is a sense outside of this place that we are in the middle of an establishment stitch-up that is trying to prevent what the people of this country voted for from happening. And the amendment that passed last night, that some of my own colleagues on this side voted for, and the cheer that went up, that there was a sense of somehow a victory had been won over those on this side who wants to see a true and proper Brexit. I want to say that victory wasn't against people like me. It was against the 17.4 million people in this country who voted for leave and believed and put their faith and trust in this place that we would deliver what they voted for. Now, I want to say that I will not be supporting the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, because I do not believe it delivers what we have promised time and time again as a party. It does not deliver what we put in our manifesto last year when we said we would respect the result of the referendum. It puts this country in a worse place in terms of negotiating than we are now. I don't understand those who say that somehow what we've failed to achieve in the last 2 years, when we've had cards to play, will somehow be better achieved when we've removed all of our cards. You know, we have had the £39 billion to bargain with. We've had the ability to walk away from the table to use to bargain with. And how we think we're going to get a better deal from the EU once we no longer have those cards to play, I fail to understand. Now, people will say, what's the alternative if we vote this deal down? And that is a very good question, and it is something that I have considered very, very seriously. But what I won't happen for me is I won't be pushed out of fear into voting for something I do not believe is right for this country simply because people tell me the consequences could be serious. We have to face that. Now, let me also say, I don't want a no deal. I want the Prime Minister to go back to the EU and say there are elements in this withdrawal agreement that are not acceptable to this House and need to be removed in order for this House to support it, and that is obviously primarily around the backstop. But if they won't do that, then the way the legislation is, no deal is the default position. And those in this House that say no deal should never, ever, ever be considered, what we're effectively doing is saying we can never leave the EU until the EU agree terms with us. And that is admitting defeat. That is saying we're effectively a colony of the EU and we can never leave of our own volition. We can only leave when they agree terms with us. And I do not believe that is right. I do not believe that that is what the future of this nation is about. And so, in voting against the deal next week, I hope that the Prime Minister will listen to the genuine concerns of many of us across the House that this deal does not deliver what we believe we promised the people of this country, and go back and say to the EU and provide a positive. I believe we need to believe in the future of our country, not just our right to be free and independent from the EU, but in our ability that we are able to do that. We are able to deliver a proper Brexit and for this country to flourish outside of the EU.
Wayne David.
Mr. Speaker, I voted in favour of Article 50 so that negotiations could begin on Britain's withdrawal from the European Union. But having read the result of the Prime Minister's negotiations, the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, I will be voting against what has been negotiated. The majority of my constituents voted to leave the European Union, But I do not believe that they voted to make themselves poorer, and they did not vote to place their safety in jeopardy. I have not taken this decision lightly, but I believe it will be enormously damaging for the people of this country, and in particular the people of my Caerphilly constituency, if Britain were to leave the EU on the basis of what the Prime Minister has negotiated. Fundamental to my concern is that the withdrawal agreement deals only with the process of Britain's departure from the European Union. For after December 2020, the only thing that has been agreed is a short political declaration of a mere 26 pages, and that document is extremely vague. In other words, if Parliament accepts the Prime Minister's package, we have no real idea of what this country's relationship with the EU will be like in the long term. It will be a blind exit. It will be a step in the dark. It will be leaving the European Union on a wing and a prayer. And the real negotiations about our long-term relationship will only really start in earnest once we had left the European Union during that transition process, and Britain will be in a weak bargaining position as a consequence. That is an issue which I am passionately concerned about. But I have to say too that I've been very concerned about the number of young people within my constituency who have expressed concerns about the situation in which this country finds itself. Those young people are concerned about their inability to travel around the European Union. They're concerned about their restriction of opportunities if travel is restricted. They're concerned about the creation of a constantly inward-looking country where their instincts teach them that they must be looking outwards to Europe and to the world. But there is also, I have to say, concern within my constituency about the employment consequences of this deal. This is an extremely important point because much of the constituency I represent prosperity, and the employment aspects of a large number of people depends on Britain having a positive relationship with our largest and nearest trading market, the European Union. This deal does not offer the prospect of such a positive relationship. There are huge problems with the short-term withdrawal agreement too, not least the weak commitments to workers' rights, which have been highlighted by the TUC, and the prospect of weak environmental standards. There's also concern, as has been highlighted in this debate, about the security implications of the transition agreement and beyond. Let's not forget that in last year, the European arrest warrant resulted in 183 individuals being brought back from other European countries to face justice in this country. Now, because of the European arrest warrant, we have seen an increase in security and justice in an international dimension. But my concern is that once we leave the European Union and go beyond the transition period of December 2020, we are by no means certain what arrangements will be in place and what will be negotiated. It is quite possible that we will have to fall back on the kind of extradition agreements which we had in the past. But let's not forget the problem that we have with France and Germany. It is that their constitutions actually prevent them entering into such extradition agreements. So there's a real concern about security and the rule of law, and that has huge implications for our future. In essence, Mr. Speaker, that is why I will be voting against the Prime Minister's deal on the 11th of December. But I want to make a point too, that I'm also strongly against any attempt to take Britain out of the European Union without an agreement. A no-deal Brexit would be disastrous for the people of my constituency, and the Prime Minister should not even contemplate, under any circumstances, such a course of action. And I have to say that it is small wonder that I've been approached by a constituent who is diabetic and insulin dependent, and he is genuinely and really concerned about what will happen to his health If we leave the European Union without a deal, and he can't get his insulin. Now, that concern can be replicated throughout the country time and time again, and it is completely wrong. But the Prime Minister is holding this sword of Damocles above the House of Commons. This is an important decision that we will face next Tuesday. But we should not underestimate the significance of this meaningful vote. But I honestly believe that this agreement is against the best interests of the people of this country, and it is against the best interests of the people in my constituency. Therefore, I have no doubt in my mind that the best and the correct and the proper thing to do is to vote against the agreement.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to follow the honourable member for Caerphilly. Now, since the EU referendum result in 2016, I think we've all been grappling with the result, what it means for our constituents, our country, and how we best respond in the interests of our country. The public are rightly tired, I believe, of Brexit. For many, it's become an issue which is far too abstract, legalistic and confusing. Frankly, they want us to get on with it, but our constituents are relying on us to get it right. Now, this debate and vote may be one of the most important that honourable and right honourable members in this place will have to make a decision upon. Probably it's one of the most important votes, if not the most important vote we will cast in our parliamentary careers. Now, almost everyone I have spoken to, whether they support this deal or not, has a huge amount of respect and admiration for the Prime Minister and the job that she is doing. Negotiating a Brexit deal with the European Union was an almost impossible job. I have never doubted the Prime Minister's desire to achieve the best for our country, and that she has poured her heart and soul into every aspect of these negotiations. And my admiration for our Prime Minister is making this decision for me all the more difficult. It goes without saying that I am loyal to this government and to this Prime Minister. Our country is undoubtedly better served by this government rather than any alternative. After 10 years in the Scottish Parliament and 18 months here, I understand the significance of even contemplating voting against my government and colleagues. But my job here is also to consider the national interest and those of my constituents. So that's why I am listening carefully to the contributions from all sides during the course of this debate, and in particular the comments from government ministers in reaction to some of the concerns that have been raised by colleagues, particularly on this side of the House. Now, part of my decision-making process, Mr. Speaker, has been considering what happens if Parliament rejects this agreement. We have been told that this is the deal, no deal, or Brexit could be stopped. Now, the default position for this process is clear. We leave the EU at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March next year with no deal. Now, this is due to both the EU Treaty and when the EU Withdrawal Act was passed earlier this year, that was amended to include the date and time of exit. It is regrettable, in my view, that there has not been greater clarity from the government as to what will happen in the event, as it seems increasingly likely that this place will not give its support to the withdrawal agreement. We are being asked to support this agreement without any proper understanding of the alternative. We are effectively balancing risks as part of our decision-making process, the risks associated with this agreement as opposed to the risks of the unknown. Whilst I have been reassured by the words from the other European leaders that fishing could still be sacrificed as part of the trade deal negotiations. Whilst I am happy to accept the words of our Prime Minister and her commitment to Scotland's fisheries, my fear is that the precise arrangements will be decided until some point in the future. Clearly, no government can bind its successors, so no promise now will necessarily have any effect in the future. Mr. Speaker, as a unionist, I also have serious concerns about the provisions for Northern Ireland, given that there will be at least a risk of Northern Ireland being treated substantially different as to the rest of the United Kingdom, which would certainly be contrary to the Articles of Union as I understand them. Now, the main nationalist parties have signed up to this agreement in Northern Ireland. However, both the UUP and DUP have said that they are completely opposed to this. Now, this causes me a serious problem. Given the troubled history in Ireland, any constitutional change needs to have the support of both communities in Northern Ireland. Now, some say that Unionists in Northern Ireland need to take a pragmatic approach. They need to compromise. But I would suggest that fundamentally misunderstands unionism in Northern Ireland. So I have every sympathy with those in this place who represent unionism in Northern Ireland, who have expressed concerns about the potential impact that this agreement will have on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. But my fundamental concern is that so much of this EU withdrawal agreement is an agreement to agree something further down the line. The can has been kicked further down the road. Now, as someone who studied law at Glasgow University and trained and worked at Freshfields along the road from here, one of my lasting memories from law school and from those teaching me how to draft legal documents is the danger of drafting something which could be construed as an agreement to agree. But so why is this a problem? An honourable member for East Surrey touched on some of the political aspects to this, but the consequence is that these agreements to agree lack sufficient certainty to constitute a legally enforceable commitment. Now, there have been many reassuring words about the high standard imposed by the Best Endeavours commitment in the withdrawal agreement, but the reality is that this is meaningless if the obligation itself lacks certainty. This withdrawal agreement was supposed to be a bridge to our permanent relationship with the EU, but the danger is that it's going to become the norm. We're putting off so many of the outstanding decisions for a later date. Now, I have wrestled with this for many hours and lost much sleep over the last few weeks. I've spoken to many businesses within my constituency and residents, and I'm here to represent their views as their Member of Parliament. I'm trying to reconcile my deep misgivings about this agreement compared to my loyalty to this Prime Minister and Government, and it's not been an easy one. In fact, it's proving to be probably the hardest decision of my political life. Now, I have until Tuesday to decide what I'm going to do, and I'm going to carefully judge what. If the members opposite perhaps show me some respect, I am wrestling with a very difficult decision on behalf of my constituents and on behalf of my country, rather than mocking my decision-making process. I would suggest.
We've heard so much from the honourable gentleman and his colleagues about threatening to resign if Northern Ireland was going to be treated any differently from anywhere else in the United Kingdom. His own Attorney General's legal advice said they'll be treated as a third country, and he is still wrestling with it. It's patently clear. Have the courage of your convictions and vote this down, because it's bad for Scotland and it'll be bad for the rest of the UK.
Well, I have not threatened to resign from anything. I have just reinforced the point. I am here to represent my constituents. Many of my constituents have concerns about this withdrawal agreement. And as somebody sitting on this side of the House, on the government benches, to express such concerns and to express such misgivings and to try as honestly as I possibly can to articulate to the House and hopefully to my constituents the thought process that I am going through. I will take as long as I need. I will certainly not be intimidated or bullied by the nationalist members opposite to make that decision any more quickly. So, Mr Speaker, I will take my time, and on Tuesday I will cast my vote, which I think is in the national interest and the interest of my constituents.
Thank you. Jonathan Edwards.
Fawr iawn, Mr Speaker. Can I start by paying tribute to you, Mr Speaker, for your longevity in not only sitting through the business today, but also last night. And I think your presence throughout the whole debate shows the importance of these deliberations. And as many members have already said, perhaps the most important votes we will ever face in our political career. And I think we can safely say, Mr Speaker, that your bladder is considerably stronger than mine. There is little doubt that people were misled during the referendum, Mr Speaker, by those purporting that a land of milk and honey awaited if Leave won. 2 years later, reality bites, and the British government has been forced into signing a humiliating agreement and a political declaration, which means that the British state, due to the intransigent policy pursued by the Prime Minister, will leave the European Union with absolutely no idea what the future trade arrangements will be with its largest trading partner after the transition phase. At every step, the British government has been outwitted by the European Commission. Their priorities were threefold. Firstly, get the British government to commit to paying its outstanding liabilities. Secondly, preserve the Good Friday Agreement leading to the backstop. And thirdly, negotiate formally only the divorce proceedings before the end of the Article 50 time period. The British Government, on the other hand, seemed to think it would be able to negotiate the terms of the final relationship and settle Brexit before the end of the Article 50 period. The withdrawal agreement and the accompanying political declaration indicate that what the British Government is claiming as a diplomatic coup is nothing of the sort. It's a capitulation. All of this does not bode well for the real detailed negotiations that will happen from March if the current policy is adopted. During those negotiations, the British Government will be a third country outside of the European Union and in a far more vulnerable position. I'm not a professional trade negotiator, Mr. Speaker. However, it's crystal clear that in those circumstances, the largest participant in the negotiations, the European Union in this case, will be able to squeeze the smaller participant. International trade is a brutal business where the size and wealth of the market matters. Brexiteers point out that under current arrangements, EU countries collectively export more to the UK than UK exports to the EU. This shows a gross misunderstanding of how international trade negotiations work. During the negotiations, the European Union's objective will be to increase this disparity in their favour at the expense of UK producers. Despite the stark economic reality, we face a Brexit policy being driven by the British Government and the Labour opposition on the basis of scrapping freedom of movement, regardless of the fact that this is a reciprocal right which works both ways. British subjects will lose the right to work and live in 27 European states. In its obsession to curb immigration, the Prime Minister set out red lines in a Mansion House speech which made the current shambles inevitable. It is because of this that my colleagues and I voted against triggering Article 50. From the very start, the Prime Minister has prioritised party management above the greater good. Like a salmon poacher, the approach of the British Government has been to massage the fantasies of Brexiteers as opposed to being straight with the people of the UK that they were sold a false prospectus, and if Brexit was to be delivered, it would mean making people far poorer, with the poorest and vulnerable worst hit. In the September withdrawal agreement debate, Mr. Speaker, I warned the British Government to take no deal off the political table. It served no purpose as a negotiating tactic with the European Union, who knew the British state would never be willing to accept the economic damage of no deal or get itself ready for the eventualities of no deal by March. I also warned that threatening no deal will not bribe MPs into supporting the Prime Minister. We will wait to see if my prophecy is correct on Tuesday evening next week. The support of the House for the amendment by the Right Honourable Member for Beaconsfield last night effectively takes no deal off the political table in any case. Right Honourable and Honourable Members and our constituents should be aware of the ruling of the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice yesterday that recommended that Article 50 is irrevocable unilaterally by the British state. If adopted by the Court, this clearly indicates the false argument put forward by the Prime Minister that it's a choice of her deal or no deal. This House or the British Government has the power to stop no deal at any time of its choosing. Considering the dire warnings of the British Government over recent weeks, the game of chicken they have been playing with members of this House now rebounds on them. If the British Government's policy is implemented, it would effectively mean leaving the European Union with absolutely no idea what the long-term future relationship will be following the end of the transition phase. The British Government have utilised this vagueness of the political declaration to try and appeal to kamikaze Brexiteers who favour the WTO option and more sensible politicians who seek a more formalised association-type agreement by saying that everything will be up for grabs during the transition phase. I have already outlined the vulnerability of the negotiating position of the British state in these circumstances. These negotiations will be far more complex than the withdrawal agreement, with far more at stake. Writing in the Western Mail last month, I described the events of the last 2 years as a tickle fight compared to what would await us if the British Government's policy is carried. Labour's policy of trying to use this crisis to force a general election is a complete distraction. I won't waste my time eviscerating their position, Mr. Speaker, but two words come to mind: incoherence and cynicism. With the House of Commons effectively in control of Brexit policy, the Labour Party must decide what it wants: a softer Brexit or a people's vote. For those are the only two options that face us which are palatable to me and many others. Firstly, a people's vote on the British Government's policy or the status quo. It seems to me that if the House of Commons can't agree on a way forward, then the people must be asked once again to cast their verdict. The only other solution I can see forward is to support moves to a formalised association status with the European Union by staying within the economic frameworks, namely the single market and the customs union. For Wales, this would end the cynical power grab of our powers by the British government, apart from policy fields not within the EEA-EFTA agreement, namely agricultural matters. The vision I and my colleagues have for Wales has no time for the narrow-minded British nationalism at the heart of the Brexit project. Out of the current wreckage, ultimately the people of my country need to start asking ourselves serious questions about where our best interests lie and what future we seek for our people. The splendid isolationism of British nationalism, or an outward-looking Wales playing our full part in the world. Mr. Speaker, I know the future I choose.
Thank you. Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to follow the honourable gentleman, though I don't agree with all of the ideas he proposes, and it's also a great honour to follow my colleague from Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who made a characteristically thoughtful speech. We've heard many ideas put forward today, but, Mr. Speaker, you'll know that lawyers are very fond of saying we are where we are. And I would urge members of this House who have put forward 650, possibly, if you can fit them all into this enormous debate, Mr. Speaker, different ideas, to look down the corridor where there's another debate going on, which is possibly even more thoughtful and perhaps a little less political than the one going on in this chamber. I, for one, was made to stop and think by reading the speech of the Archbishop earlier today, and I would encourage honourable members from all sides to have a little look at what's going on down the corridor. Banbury constituency in the 2016 referendum was the closest in the country. By 500, we voted to leave. I have seen no evidence from talking to people or in my postbag that significant numbers on either side have changed their minds, so there have been a few. I think it's really important that, given where we are now sensible and practical. I think this is a fair deal. In fact, it's true to say, Mr. Speaker, it's a deal that's growing on me as I read it more and more, and I listen to debates such as this one. There are two reasons, mainly, why I think that this is a fair deal. We have some beginnings of certainty about the status of EU nationals and some inkling of where our immigration policy is going in this deal. Immigration is something we know a fair bit about in North Oxfordshire. In fact, Poles make up 10% of the population of Banbury. We also have another significant minority group, the Kashmiris, who've been with us in some cases for 4 generations. The Poles and Romanians that we have living with us locally are very well integrated, and we value their contribution to our workforce and all aspects of public life. I am very concerned that we put flesh on the bones of this withdrawal agreement, and I'm looking forward to engaging in detail with the white paper so that they know really practical solutions to problems like, will Granny be able to join them when she needs care in her old age? But I do think this is going in the right direction, and that is one reason why I am inclined to vote for this deal. I am also persuaded by the almost frictionless trade ideas which are set out. Of course the future agreement needs more work, but I do think we are going in the right direction. In Banbury, we're lucky to have almost full employment. We have a wide selection of middle-sized family firms manufacturing food and automotive industry machines and bits of parts which are part of that really critical just-in-time European-wide systems. I thought, when I hoped that I would be able to speak in this debate, that I would ask my business leaders what they would like me to say. I asked a wide selection, but I've chosen 2 in particular to read out. One is a great local entrepreneur. He was a Brexiteer, which is unusual among my business leaders, and he now runs a company which is a leading distributor of health and beauty and household brands. He says, and I quote, "The deal on the table sorts several of the big Brexit issues, immigration being one. It also protects trade. Smooth trade through ports and ferry terminals is vital to the UK. So much of everything we eat and use comes from Europe. Likewise, our exports are crucial to many UK businesses, especially automotive. My view is we should sign it. I haven't seen any credible alternative proposals from others. The Irish solution was always going to be difficult. It should not become a deal breaker. No deal would be a disaster. I'd also like to quote from another representative of a company which manufactures high-end tools. This lady was a passionate Remainer. And I am particularly fond of both her and her business, as indeed was my predecessor. They are a great local employer, and one of the notable things is when you go round their factory, you come across people who've worked there for 35 years, and successive generations of their families have worked there. She says, "The deal that is now on the table, I believe, is the best we could get. It isn't as good as staying in for obvious reasons. You don't get a better deal by being out of the club than you get by being in it. But it is a deal that an export company like ours can work with. And while trade with the EU will cease to be completely frictionless, we have until 2021 to get things in place to deal with that. If I do my best to be positive about the situation, there may also be benefits for trade outside the EU post-transition. Although I sincerely hope not at the cost of lower standards for products, employee protection, the environment or animal welfare." Mr. Speaker, I couldn't have put it better myself. In Banbury, we were, you could say, the most divided constituency on the 23rd of June 2016. I have seen lots of evidence locally that we are prepared to come together, to work together, and have a bright future with the deal that's on the table.
Thank you. Angela Crawley.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, thank you for calling me in this debate, and I appreciate your forbearance and patience because it's been a long afternoon. But I just wanted to say, first of all, my constituency of Lanark and Hamilton East voted, along with every other area in Scotland, to remain, and yet time and time again Scotland has been repeatedly ignored. Now, because I have such limited time, I'm going to focus what I wish to say on three main points, and that is that this deal, I believe, is bad for young people, it's bad for women, and it's bad for the economy.
Hear, hear.
Now, the SNP have repeatedly argued it was best for jobs, economy and living standards to remain in the single market, and we refused to be dragged by those on the right into a self-defeating argument about immigration. Instead, at every opportunity, we focused on the positives of the freedom of movement and the ability to live, work and travel across 27 countries. And yet, as well as the rich economic, cultural and societal benefits that migrants have brought to our country, since 2016, many of the EU citizens and their families that I've met with, French-born, German-born, teachers, nurses, people who have raised their families and for the vast majority of their life have spent their time in Scotland are concerned about their ability to continue to live in the home that they call Scotland. Now, that's just one instance of where there is still a lack of certainty. But for young people, it was my predecessor, Winnie Ewan, Madame Ecosse, who championed the Erasmus programme. And we should not deny future generations of young people the opportunity to learn, to travel and to broaden their horizons. And sadly, that's exactly what Brexit will only serve to do. In fact, if anything, the opposite. It is for all of these reasons and more that the SNP have repeatedly argued to remain in the EU and, short of that, remain in the single market and the customs union, without which free trade arrangements, which will introduce barriers to trade, will damage jobs, investments, productivity and earnings. And on that point, I wanted to come to the point of women, because in fact this will only serve to hit the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable the hardest. The Women's Budget Group and the Fawcett Society examined the economic impact on Brexit and found serious implications for women, predominantly those who are workers, consumers and the vast majority who are users of public services. The cuts that this government have placed on them already have a disproportionate impact on women, and yet a failure to prioritise gender equality has led to an increased economic insecurity and inequality for these women. Now, there is nothing that this debate has served to do except to highlight how much of Brexit has taken over the agenda, when I should have been in Westminster Hall this afternoon condemning the government on its record on gender inequality, but instead I'm here debating this. But that's, of course, where we're at, and I wouldn't choose to be anywhere else on this day than debate this important subject. But there are so many other important subjects that are being completely neglected. Now, In most scenarios, real wages for low-paid workers have been reduced and prices will increase and inevitably increase further, as well as the reduced levels of productivity. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty outlined that it was clear that the impact of Brexit was an afterthought, and that's the point here. So I wish to focus on those who have already been forgotten in this debate. Now, the vulnerable in my constituency, the 1 in 4 children who grow up in poverty, are only and that's only expected to increase. And people will ultimately be worse off, and we know this for a fact. Is that not a sufficient reason in itself for the government to reconsider its actions, to prioritise protecting the interests of those who need it most and who are most at risk of the harsh impact of Brexit? Instead, what are we doing? We're freezing their benefits, we're hitting them with 5-week delays in universal credit, and we're fully acknowledging by visiting food banks that there's an issue here and that we need to do more to support food banks. It's a scandal, frankly, that these people are an afterthought, and that's frankly how this comes across. While we stand here and discuss Brexit, people won't go hungry at Christmas, people will go without food, children will go without gifts, and that's the least of many families' problems. Now, my constituency is home to many multinational companies that rely on trade with Europe. In fact, Europe is the 8th largest, or 8 times the size of the UK market. So our relationship with Europe couldn't be more important. So whether it's DFDS, the largest employer in Larkhall, that duly delivers to all major fish markets and distribution centres, whether it's Tunnets and Uddingston, who sell their famous tea cakes and caramel wafers across Europe and beyond, whether it's Borders Biscuits based in Lanark with customers across the EU, all of these businesses are not only businesses who trade across Europe, but they're employers in my constituency. Now, their trade and the trade of many others rely on a good deal for Europe, and it is in my opinion that this withdrawal deal fails to deliver. It offers no guarantees of frictionless access to the single market. It places Scotland at a serious competitive disadvantage to Northern Ireland and, frankly, to the Union that you're so keen to keep. It's no certainty for stability for the UK's economy and relationship with the EU in the long term. And thank you for chuntering from a sedentary position. Let's remember that in 2014, the people were told to remain in the EU. That the only way to remain in the UK was to remain in the EU is to remain as part of the UK. Now, please tell me how that's working out for us. Good job, guys. So, frankly, tonight, as cross-party support across the Scottish Parliament from 4 of the 5 main parties reject this deal, it is now time for all of these reasons and more that I will be voting against this withdrawal arrangement and agreement and supporting the amendments to protect businesses, to protect jobs, and most importantly to protect the most vulnerable in my constituency. I cannot honestly in good conscience vote for a bad deal, and the bottom line is this. See, when the Tories and everyone else across here protected the Union by telling people they could stay in the EU and then pulling the rug out from under them the minute people voted to remain part of the UK, what kind of deal is that for Scotland? So of course Scotland's going to vote for independence.
Thank you. Extremely useful. Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Now, there's been much talk about the backstop and about the deal in general. So much talk that if there was a single word in the English language, in my view, that should be deleted at the earliest opportunity, it's the word deal. Because this isn't about shopping around for a second-hand car or a better mobile phone tariff. It's about our relationship with our nearest neighbours. And this is one thing that we probably all could agree on, is the relationships between states in the modern world are complicated, very complicated. They can't just be reduced to deal or no deal. Yet after 2.5 years, that's how the argument is all too often presented. And given that the political declaration is so vague and thin, let me try and characterise where we've got to in stark terms. Many have talked of cliff edges. To me, it looks as if we've reached the edge and we've jumped. That's the withdrawal agreement bit. Well, we have a 2-year transition period to sort out what happens before we hit the ground. It's quite a high cliff. And the political declaration is the rope by which we are dangling. But while we're dangling from that rope, the clock is ticking. We will hit the ground. And because that ground is the backstop from which we effectively have no exit, we've effectively handed the scissors to the people at the top of the cliff. They may let us land gently, but they don't have to. Frankly, as negotiating positions go, the clock ticking, heading towards somewhere you really don't want to be, this really isn't a very good place. And then there's a simple fact of geography. We are part of Europe, just as Ireland is one Ireland, and nothing can change either of those facts. So we will have a relationship. It's just a case of what kind it will be. And I've got news for those who feel that they've already had enough of all this Brexit stuff and all the negotiations. Frankly, we're only just at the beginning of all this. And the great irony, Mr. Speaker, is that the EU is actually the place where negotiations are done. So coming out doesn't end the need for coming to agreements with others or following standards that much bigger trading partners will decide. It just makes it all harder. And that point is actually well made by someone I wouldn't normally find myself in agreement with, the Right Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, who wrote for the Mail on Sunday in February 2016, and he said, "When a deal is reached, it may require us to accept the same blizzard of regulations that is imposed by Brussels, not just on member states, but on countries like Norway and Switzerland that need access to European markets, and like them, it's possible we'd have no say over what those regulations contained, while still potentially paying an access fee." Now, I wouldn't have used that exact language, but I have to say on that, I rather agree with the Right Honourable Member, of course, is now the Home Secretary. And it's no surprise that this proposed agreement, despite the very hard work of officials over many months, cannot deliver what was promised by the Leave campaign. No surprise, because what was promised was just not deliverable. So the political declaration, unsurprisingly, is just a wish list, kicking decisions down the road for future discussion while leaving a vacuum of uncertainty. Moving more specifically, Mr. Speaker, to today's debate topic of immigration and free movement, I can tell you this has been a cause of intense distress and uncertainty in Cambridge since the referendum. Not just with the thousands of non-UK EU nationals who are anxious about their future, but it's been causing real distress for their friends, for their neighbours, for their workmates, who never expected to suddenly see their friends facing such divisions. Now, in recent months, I've worked with my neighbour, the Honourable Member for South Cambridgeshire, and the business group Cambridge Ahead, in surveying businesses, universities and research institutes across our constituencies, and their responses are very consistent. A third country-style immigration process for EE nationals would add more bureaucracy, time and cost to their recruitment which is essential due to skill shortages in the UK labour force and a global market in research specialisms. The Tier 2 visa system and a £30,000 salary cap already doesn't work for non-EEA migration. Extending it to EEA movement would be a major own goal for our country. And I've had very detailed evidence submitted to our inquiry from the University of Cambridge, and I'll just quote a little from it. They say, "The postdoctoral research community serves as the engine room for much of the research that underpins Cambridge's world-leading reputation and provides a source of the ideas, innovation, business generation and disruptive technology that enables the UK to compete as a high-tech economy. Any barriers or disincentives to such recruitment, such as visa costs, could therefore have a significant impact on the university's research and education operations." And they go on to say, "Extending the Tier 2 visa route to EEA nationals, as suggested in the MAC report, would therefore significantly harm the UK's competitiveness." I just underline that, Mr. Speaker, significantly harm the UK's competitiveness. Now, we're of course having this debate in the absence of a policy direction from a government that can't even agree a white paper. But I do hope that the view from Cambridge goes some way to exposing the risks that we would be taking if we continue with a backward-looking, numbers-only, focused approach to immigration as the nature of our relationship with the European Union changes. We should, of course, be celebrating the benefits of movement between countries, not cowering in fear. We are at the global forefront of research, of science, of medicine. We surely shouldn't be risking throwing that away. This agreement gives us no certainty over future mobility for research or for any other sector or individual. And it's not just what are traditionally termed the highly skilled. We also need the cooks, the cleaners, the bus drivers, the builders, because our policy should be based on the needs of our economy, not on fear of being part of a rapidly changing world. But this deal fails on other fronts too. The Prime Minister has gone from high aims to be part of the European Medicines Agency and the European Research Council's programmes to what we now have, a hope of some form of cooperation. With such weak, limited ambition, the future for research and innovation, the shining star in the UK economy, looks much less bright. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, there is a very, very good deal on offer. It's the one we currently have as members of the European Union. But if we are to remain, it has to be remain and reform. The EU has to respond to the unhappiness expressed in so many countries across Europe. Business as usual just won't cut it. That's the debate we really should be having. It's inescapable that we live in Europe, but what kind of Europe do we want it to be? I don't think this government is capable of facilitating that kind of discussion with the public. So in my view, the only way out of the impasse we appear to be heading for is an election or a people's vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to speak in the debate here this evening. And I just want to make a couple of general comments and then some specific comments. I was reflecting, and I think the country would be reflecting, on how it is that we've actually arrived at this point. And I have to say, it seems to me to be a catastrophic failure of leadership that has brought us to within a few weeks of when we're supposed to be leaving the European Union without any clear plan as to what that should be. No clear consensus in this Parliament or indeed in our country. And I think when the history books are written, they will look back and see this as absolutely catastrophic with respect to the way the government have run things since the referendum. I think as well as that, I think what will also go down in history, Mr. Speaker, is that history will write this was a time when Parliament, particularly yesterday, recognised the importance of it reasserting its authority to try to ensure that some sort of reason was brought to the chaos that we see all around us. It cannot be, Mr. Speaker, how can it be that a government is held in contempt by the Parliament that it is supposed to control? It has never ever happened in our history. And it is simply astonishing that it just seems to have been swept away. So I say, and really say with a sense of sorrow, that we are in a situation now where we, as a Parliament, are looking to say what sort of future do we want for our country and how do we try to resolve this. Well, it seems to me, Mr. Speaker, that Parliament is about trying to say we need to re-establish and rebuild a consensus. And there will be a variety of views as to how that is done. But one thing that Parliament said, so let's be clear about this, Mr. Speaker, one thing that Parliament has said quite clearly, and from everyone in this House virtually who's spoken, it is not a binary choice between what the Prime Minister has put before us or no deal at all. That is not the choice that faces our country. Whatever part of the United Kingdom you are from, that is a false choice. And it does the Prime Minister no good at all, and the country more no good at all, for that to be presented as that. And so the decision that this Parliament took yesterday to say that we will not allow a no deal to take place should reassure the country. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, it is therefore unclear what happens, as we all expect, the Prime Minister, if she pursues this particular course of action. It is unclear what happens after Tuesday, if the deal, as we all expect, and it should be, is voted down. But I, for one, will join with my colleagues in happily marching through the voting chambers to vote against this deal, in the belief that this Parliament will ensure that a better deal for the whole of the United Kingdom and the people of the United Kingdom will be got as a result of standing up and saying we will not be bullied by the executive. So what does that mean? What does that actually mean? Well, I believe we can. It may be that we have to extend Article 50. It may be that we have to go back to the European Union. It may be there will be a general election. It may even be there will be a second referendum. All of those things are unknown. But step by step and bit by bit, this Parliament will look at the facts and govern in the interests of the country. And that is what is important. And that is what I think is significant about what happened yesterday, Mr. Speaker. And let's also say in this debate, we can, as a Parliament, start to reassert some of the values and some of the things that perhaps more should have been said more loudly during the referendum campaign. Let me start with immigration. I think immigration has been good for this country. I think it has benefited this country. That should be said loudly and clearly, time and time again, as virtually every member, let's put it this way, sorry, I would correct myself, every member in this Parliament would agree with. But why don't we shout it out? Why don't we take the bigots on? Why don't we take the racists on? Much more assertively than we do. And I say this about migration, not just immigration. There have been problems with migration, Mr. Speaker. But I tell you this, migration overall has been good for this country as well. Now, that isn't to say there aren't problems with it, and of course they need to be dealt with. But as soon as you give ground on these things, then into that space flows populism and all of the sort of establishment rhetoric that we start to hear. And that was a failure in the referendum campaign. And let me also say this, it does no good, Mr. Speaker, for the government, the executive, to pretend that this deal sorts anything out. If we do leave at the end of March in 2019, what is important is the fact that nothing is decided. My constituents, and I think many constituents, and I have to say, just to be honest about it, until a few weeks ago, I thought as well that leaving the European Union would mean large numbers of things would have been sorted out about trade, about security, all of these things. And then I read the political declaration, there's not much has been decided other than we are going to leave, if that happens. And then after that, this political declaration. And what does the political declaration say, Mr. Speaker? It says we will consider, our aspiration is, we look to, we hope that. My goodness me, Mr. Speaker, is that what we're asking the British people to accept as a result of our withdrawal from the European Union? So I'll finish with this. I don't quite know where we go, but I do know this. The fact that this Parliament has reasserted its authority means that we will be able to stand up in whatever way we feel is correct in the interests of the British people, and we will put them first, whatever part of the United Kingdom we represent.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is an honour, if not a challenge, to follow the excellent contribution from the Right Honourable Member from Gedling.
Well said.
Mr. Speaker, it will surprise no one when I say that I, along with every one of my SNP colleagues, will be voting against the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement when the House divides on Tuesday. And I will vote against it because it's a very bad deal for Scotland, but also because it's a potentially catastrophic deal for the people of my Argyll and Bute constituency. What we in Argyll and Bute have been asked to do by the Prime Minister is to support a deal, one that by every analysis will make us poorer, and one which will put us at a competitive disadvantage when compared to our near neighbours in Northern Ireland, just a few miles across the water from the Mull of Kintyre. Mr. Speaker, I believe it would be a dereliction of duty on my part if I was to back this deal, because I would not be acting in the best interests of my constituents, or my country, or indeed the rest of the United Kingdom, if I was to support a deal which I believe would be harmful to the social, economic and cultural well-being of the people of Argyll and Bute. For the past 2 years, the Prime Minister has told us repeatedly that no deal is better than a bad deal. We were assured that there were no circumstances in which the Prime Minister would sign up to a bad deal, and yet what we're being asked to vote on next week is exactly that, a bad deal, a very bad deal, because any deal that puts Scotland at a competitive disadvantage can only be a bad deal. And any deal which prevents us from attracting people to Argyll and Bute from right across Europe to live, to work, invest, to raise a family, in order to reverse decades-long stream of depopulation is a very bad deal. And I commend 100% and endorse the remarks made last night by my right honourable friend, the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, when he said to those EU nationals who have chosen to make Scotland their home that you are welcome. We thank you for choosing to live in Scotland. We welcome the contribution you make to our lives and our economy, and your presence enriches our culture.
Hear, hear.
And that point was made forcibly to me last night by a constituent who contacted me, Mr Graham Lyon, and he wants to know how the Prime Minister can justify causing such economic and social harm by the ending of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement, which I say has enriched every one of us in this country. So how can I possibly support such an agreement? One that will have such disastrous consequences for our inshore fisheries fleet, our world-famous shellfish and finfish industries, one that fails to protect our fragile West Coast hill farming community, and one that denies our vital tourism industry the access to that continent-wide pool of labour they so desperately need. I will not and I cannot support this deal. Of course, Mr Speaker, none of this should come as a surprise to the Prime Minister, because she came to Scotland personally last week to meet the people of the country and to listen to their concerns. Yes, right, so she did. Because meeting and listening to the people of Scotland does not mean arriving at Glasgow Airport at 3 o'clock, driving 12 minutes to a factory at Bridge of Weir, where a hand-picked group of journalists were waiting while the rest stood outside in the rain. It's not about firing out that old cliché about our precious union before jumping back in the car for the 12-minute drive back to Glasgow Airport, to be back in the air and out the country by 6 o'clock that evening. Mr Speaker, that is nobody's definition of meeting or listening to the people of Scotland. In fact, it's an insult to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister really wanted to hear the voice of Scotland, then perhaps she should have listened to the CNN report by Erin McLaughlin that was done from Glasgow on that same day as she flew into Bridge of Weir. Because what that report showed was that the people of Scotland were insulted by the contempt shown by the Prime Minister, by this sham of a PR stunt. It showed also that the people of Scotland don't want to be dragged out of the European Union against their will. Indeed, one young Glaswegian gentleman was so incensed that he inadvertently perhaps used a form of industrial language rarely heard on the streets of the Deer Green place. And what the CNN report also showed was that the people of Glasgow and the people of Scotland are moving from no to yes on the question of Scottish independence. Because this was not the future that Scotland was promised in 2014, when we were told that only by voting no in the independence referendum would we be able to retain our European Union citizenship. No one was told, when they voted no back in 2014, that not only would they be giving the green light to Scotland being dragged out of the European Union, but that Scotland would become poorer and would be put quite deliberately at a competitive disadvantage compared to other parts of the UK. The hollow promises made by those advocating a no vote in 2014 was that the Scottish Parliament would be the world's most powerfully devolved Parliament. And yet from that day to this, that Parliament has been ignored, sidelined and disregarded. And tonight, that Parliament rejected the Prime Minister's withdrawal deal by 92 to 29 votes. I wonder what cognizance this government will take of that world's most powerfully devolved Parliament. I suspect we already know the answer to that one, Mr Speaker. But I sincerely ask them to take on board what the Scottish Parliament has said, because they are absolutely right. There is an escape route being offered, and I urge the government to take it, because despite what the Prime Minister's bluster, I do not believe that this is a take it or leave it situation. Mr Speaker, this whole Brexit process has been an embarrassing fiasco. Over the past 2 years, we've heard about a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit and a blind Brexit. Well, Mr Speaker, I think after yesterday we are now in the realms of a bust-ball Brexit. And regardless of how this fiasco is resolved, this is exactly why Scotland needs the full powers of an independent Parliament, not just so we can stop and reverse this Brexit chaos, but to ensure that never again will Scotland be reduced to being a passive bystander while things are done to it and for it by a government and a Prime Minister that the people of Scotland have overwhelmingly and consistently rejected.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Argyll and Bute. I
rise today, Mr. Speaker, as one of the Brexit generation of politicians, elected to this place because of the causes and the consequences of Brexit, finding myself now as a member of this House, faced with a divided Parliament and a divided country, embroiled in a constitutional crisis not seen in our history before, and being asked to use my vote on behalf of my constituents to make this great country of ours poorer and weaker in the world. Understandably, Mr. Speaker, in that context, many people look to us here bemused and questioning our ability as elected politicians to lead and to serve. Regardless of whether one voted to leave or stay in the European Union, we haven't got what we were promised. The Prime Minister's proposals are worse than our current position, and they will mean that Brexit will dominate the political agenda for many, many years to come. Leave voters were promised £350 million a year for the NHS. Instead, we have European doctors and nurses leaving us, and risk assessments from government resulting in the stockpiling of medicines. Leave voters were promised the UK could go it alone with new trade deals from around the world. Instead, we've seen the United States say they're not that interested, and the prospect of a transition period which we may never get out of, making us unable to conclude trade deals until 2021 at the earliest. Leave voters were promised that we'd take back control of our laws. Instead, the Prime Minister's proposals lock us into European regulations without the UK having a meaningful say whatsoever, unsurprisingly confirming that we have more power and more influence as a member of the European Union. We haven't got what we were promised. Our current position is far better, and we will be locked into a debate on Brexit for the next decade. Mr. Speaker, Britain is a powerful nation. We're one of the largest and most sophisticated economies in the world. We should be proud of our status and the benefits that brings to the British people. In contrast, the Prime Minister's proposals are a humiliation. And for my constituents of Bristol North West, who voted in majority to remain and based on my extensive engagement with them continue to want to do so, whether for advanced manufacturing jobs in aerospace or automotive across North Bristol, NHS jobs at Southmead Hospital, research jobs at our two universities, for those in warehousing or logistic jobs relying on import and export in and around the port in Avonmouth, our current position as a member of the European Union is far stronger than any other option on the table. I did not put myself forward to become the Member of Parliament for my home constituency, where I was born and raised, only to come here and vote to make them poorer. And whether I'm an MP for a short or a long period of time, as a millennial, Mr. Speaker, and as the father of a daughter who turns 1 today, I will be left to deal with the mess left behind by this incompetent government long after it leaves these Treasury benches. And so in the face of an inevitable rejection of the Prime Minister's proposals, I support a call for a people's vote. Because all of us, regardless of whether we voted to stay or to leave, now know what leaving the EU means. I didn't know when I voted to remain, nor did people that voted to leave. New facts have emerged. It's not patronising to say to people that they have the right to change their mind now that they know what that means. A basis of rules on which we leave and a wish list for the future. And it's not undemocratic to provide more democracy by going back to people and saying you have the right. It is the right of the British people to have that final say, whether we leave on the Prime Minister's proposed basis or we stay in the European Union. But securing a people's vote isn't the end, regardless of whether the outcome of that would be to leave or to stay. Because we now know loud and clear that the country is divided, driven apart by an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots, the cities and the towns, the south and the north, the old from the young, the rich from the poor and struggling. Characterised by access to education, the ability to rent or own a secure home, relying on struggling public services, and the despair that comes from flatlining wages and a fear that our children are being raised in a country in decline. Leaving the European Union will not fix these woes, and neither will remaining unless we remain and reform both the European Union and Britain. As politicians, Mr. Speaker, it is our job to step up to that cry for change, to put forward a radical programme of reforms that shows we can be on the up once again. As politicians, we mustn't pander to the politics of the easy answer, as we have seen in this Brexit campaign, and be honest about the significant challenges facing our country in a fast-changing world. embracing the opportunity and the power of patriotism to drive our great nation forward, and discarding the destructive desire of national populism to secure power for power's sake. Mr. Speaker, this country of ours feels like it's coming to the end of its current chapter. In a proudly sovereign parliament, at the centre of a strong and successful United Kingdom, we have a choice to make about what comes next. A proudly sovereign parliament, our sovereignty derived from the British people, which gives us the right to go back to them to check and ask for further instruction. I truly hope, Mr. Speaker, that from the ashes of Brexit, whatever that will mean, that we choose a future of hope and possibility anchored in the reality of the world that we find ourselves in, and not another chapter of self-inflicted populist decline. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this very important debate, and I have to say it's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Bristol North West. Mr. Speaker, like other honourable members here tonight, I am very concerned about the government's proposals and the serious implications for our country and indeed the local community in my constituency of Reading East. In my view, the negotiations have produced what is quite simply a deeply flawed draft agreement, and I'm very concerned about how our relationship with other European countries could develop in the future. I firmly believe that the proposals are against the national interest and that they could damage our economy and also could harm local communities across this country. Mr. Speaker, a number of other members have made some clear and indeed telling points this afternoon about the weakness of the UK's position should these proposals be agreed. I would like to associate myself with the speech by my right honourable friend, the member for Hackney, and also to commend the speech of the member for East Surrey and my right honourable friend for Gedling. I do not accept the government's assertion that we either have to accept the proposed deal or have no deal, and I am pressing for a much closer and much more sensible relationship with the EU. Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom would quite simply be in a dreadful position if we were to sign up to the government's Brexit deal. And yet the government is still trying to foist this deal on our country. Mr. Speaker, that cannot be right, and that is why I will be voting against the deal, and I would urge other members here tonight to do the same. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to turn to the substance of today's debate. I want to speak about the very serious impact of the government's proposals on my constituency of Reading East, and with regard in particular to the issue of immigration. Families are suffering very real stress and hardship because of government policy. Thousands of local residents are from the EU, and many families in our area include both British and EU citizens. Imagine the worry and stress that those families have suffered during the last 2 years, and also consider what they are suffering now. The government's failed negotiation and the lack of a plan for the future has led to families facing enormous uncertainty. Ministers have refused to accept Labour's alternative, which would offer clarity and certainty to both EU residents in the UK and indeed to British citizens in Europe, who are sometimes forgotten. Mr. Speaker, businesses and public services also need that clarity and certainty, and they, I believe, have been very badly let down by the government. My constituents in Reading and Woodley are at risk of being badly affected by a shortage of skilled workers caused by the failure of this government's policies. The risk to our NHS in particular is clear. GPs, our hospital and other services are already under severe pressure. They face increased demand from a growing and ageing population, insufficient funding and the additional problems of high housing costs, making it harder for medical staff to afford to live in our area. In addition, our local NHS is particularly vulnerable to the loss of staff from the EU, as a large number of EU citizens work in the local health service. EU staff make up just 5% of the NHS's total workforce. However, the proportion is much higher in my constituency. As many as 12.8% of the employees at the Royal Berkshire Hospital are from the EU. That is 2.5 times the proportion in the NHS as a whole. And, Mr. Speaker, this deal also risks inflicting serious damage on our local economy. Reading, as many may know, is home to a number of IT and telecoms businesses. These international firms are major employers which create a significant benefit to our local economy and indeed to the wider area across the south of England and West London. Many have their Europe, Middle East and Africa head offices in the Thames Valley, and they are there in part because of the access to the EU and the wider pool of skilled staff. Many of these businesses hire skilled staff from the EU precisely because the two-tier visa system for non-EU staff is too expensive and too complicated to navigate. And there are very real concerns that if they cannot bring teams together quickly due to immigration rules or cannot move staff immediately due to visa requirements, that there is a risk, a very serious risk, that business could move away from the UK. Reading is also home to a number of tech startups. These are small and medium-sized enterprises which drive innovation and add immense value to our local and indeed the national economy. Many such small firms are run or started by people from the EU as well as UK nationals, and they may well have come to our area precisely because of that international outlook. They contribute their knowledge, entrepreneurship and hard work. They are also, Mr. Speaker, deeply concerned about the uncertainty over Brexit, which exposes their business to significant and unnecessary risk. And yet, despite all this evidence from my area and across the country, the government has quite simply failed to set out sensible plans for immigration. Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary told the Home Affairs Committee it will be published soon, and it's unlikely that members will see it before the meaningful vote next week. And the political declaration includes less than a page on the future migration policy. It commits the government to ending free movement, but it fails to include a plan for what will replace it. Mr. Speaker, the government has quite simply failed to deliver on its promises on immigration. It's failed on immigration just as it's failed to deliver a Brexit deal that protects jobs, workplace rights and frictionless trade for UK businesses. Mr. Speaker, this simply is not acceptable. Members across the House have a right to know what the new immigration system would look like before we cast our votes next week. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, I've never accepted there is a choice between Theresa May's failed deal, the Prime Minister's failed deal, and no deal. No government has the right to plunge this country into chaos as a result of its own failure.
Thank you. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Reading East, who spoke so eloquently about the fears and worries of his constituents, and many of my constituents have told me of the same challenges and fears that they face if Brexit goes ahead. Now, I campaigned to remain in the EU, and my constituency voted to remain. And I also voted against triggering Article 50 because I felt that there was so much work to be done to establish exactly what Brexit would mean for this country, knowing that the promises given to Leave voters were untruths and, as we well know, are undeliverable. There was no mention by Leave campaigners of the conflict between Brexit and retaining the Good Friday Agreement. And there was nothing on the impact of leaving the EU on our rights at work, on our environmental and consumer standards, and the impact of losing the significant benefits from UK's full membership of and influence in bodies such as the European Medicines Agency, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and so many more. Now, Mr. Speaker, 28 months later, we've got no further than documents containing broad principles with massive gaps. It's not a deal, but just a framework. And I will not vote for such a pile of vagueness, and I certainly won't vote for no deal either. Mr. Speaker, the lack of the long-awaited immigration white paper is just one of many legislative gaps in the issues on which we're expected to vote on next Tuesday. Now, on immigration, EU migrants are integral members of our society and are vital to our economy. For those here now and for those who may want to come to the UK in the future, the Prime Minister's deal offers nothing concrete on which they can plan their future lives on. Thousands of my constituents are citizens of other EU countries. They work as carers, construction workers, they work for the NHS, for the massive hospitality sector and for many other sectors, across the private and the public sectors. This morning, I met my constituent, Annette, a German national. She's been here 30 years, married to and mother of UK nationals. She's apoplectic at being accused of jumping the queue, given what she's contributed to the UK, not only in taxes as a higher rate taxpayer, but because her professional working life has been spent working in teams of highly skilled nationals of many EU countries, improving services, providing millions of pounds of benefits and international prestige to our public and our private sectors. And what about those whose future plans are based on freedom of movement? There are many reasons, Mr. Speaker, that young people voted so strongly for Remain. And a major factor of that was the freedom to work, study, live and love anywhere in Europe. For young people, whether they choose to travel or not, in addition, remaining in the EU is the key to prosperity for their futures. On top of the rising costs and lower wages my children's generation already face, I am not prepared to commit their future to the recession that the government's own analysis clearly predicts. And if another referendum were held now, another 1.8 million young people, and that's today, have now reached voting age since 2016, and they want a say in their future. And I have no doubt that they will follow the voting preference of the 18-year-olds in June 2016. Now, on the economy and jobs, there isn't a business or a sector that won't be worse off if the UK leaves the EU, and at least the government now has the grace to accept that. The broadcasting and audiovisual sector, for instance, just one, but it's important to my constituency, to many of my constituents who work across West London in the sector. The UK, Mr. Speaker, is Europe's leading international broadcasting hub, home to more cross-border channels than any other EU country. West London has grown as a hub for international broadcasting, taking advantage not only of the skills base, but the unique range of languages spoken in London, which has come about partly through the freedom of movement that EU membership has brought us. The EU is setting up a digital single market because of the importance of frictionless movement, trade and similar regulations. But the country of origin rule means that to broadcast into EU countries as a broadcaster needs to be based in an EU country. So Brexit will mean the growth in the sector will be killed stone dead and the UK's competitive edge will be lost. Companies such as Discovery, based in my constituency, have already announced plans to leave the UK. They cannot wait for the uncertainty of the next 2 years and, like others, are gradually moving investment and staff. There is nothing in either the withdrawal agreement nor the political agreement to give any comfort to this major and currently growing sector. And the same is true, as other members have spoken in this chamber yesterday and today and will do in the next few days, nor to many other sectors, which are important to all our constituents. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, what was promised in 2016 by the Leave campaign cannot be delivered, and even Cabinet Ministers now admit that. And this deal is much, much worse than the deal we have now. In the EU, a full voting and influential member of all the many European arrangements and organisations that make for stability, and the benefit of being a full player in the largest economic bloc in the world. With no majority in this House for the Prime Minister's deal, nor for no deal, then the only option available is to put the vote back to the people, with all the implications of each option clearly set out.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although I've spoken over 100 debates since I've come to this House, none have been as important as this debate, which will guide the future of this country for generations to come. Many honourable members have covered the security implications. It's worth reflecting on the fact the agreement makes no mention of Europol, says the UK be locked out of EU tools, including the Schengen Information System, European Arrest Warrant and European Criminal Records Information System when the transition period ends. The Police Federation, which represents 120,000 rank-and-file officers, they had no idea what the policing landscape will look like post-29th of March 2019. This, in and of itself, is enough to reject the agreement, as presented to us. The Prime Minister's deal merely pushes back decisions into transition, doesn't even answer what sort of Brexit we will get, which the security arrangements are merely the tip of our Titanic iceberg. After the Prime Minister gave a statement to the House, she said the post-transition options for the future relationship with the EU were a spectrum. I asked the Prime Minister what her spectrum was, and her response was, there is a balance between checks and controls and the acceptance of rules and regulations. Are any of us clear on the Prime Minister's spectrum? No, I can see that we're not. I believe we have 5 basic options going forward. We have no-deal Brexit, we have the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, we have a renegotiation of the withdrawal deal, and we have membership of the European Free Trade Association with a customs union, so-called Norway Plus, and we have remaining in the EU. Everyone understands no deal, and that we leave over 70 international trade deals in the all-Ireland electricity market ceases, with the potential to completely disrupt Northern Ireland's power supply. The chaos around customs checks puts all goods coming to the country at risk: food, medicine, fuel, machine parts. The government's technical notices make some grim reading. But after passing the Right Honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield, my former MP in fact, amendment last night, we are on the road to assert the will of the House and avoid a no-deal Brexit. The Prime Minister's deal means no immediate cliff edge, but instead leaving the EU into a transition of at least 21 months when we stay within and would need to operate all EU rights and regulations. But what then? Well, the Prime Minister's non-answer tells you all you need to know. The government would negotiate a free trade deal that is a balance between checks and controls and the acceptance of rules and regulations. Considering this is all they've managed in the last 20 months, I cannot write them a blank cheque, and it might not even be a cheque made out to the current Prime Minister. So I cannot and will not support the EU withdrawal agreement when it comes before Parliament next Tuesday. I have consistently said I cannot support any option which doesn't protect jobs by preserving tariff-free, barrier-free, frictionless trade with the rest of Europe. That will retain current employer, consumer rights, environmental standards, and at least keep pace with them in the future, as well as no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, Gibraltar and Spain, and our sovereign territory on Cyprus and the Republic of Cyprus. Let's remember the single market accounts 25% of global GDP and represents the biggest trading partner. I believe only the latter 3 options I've outlined can achieve this. Yesterday we saw the government lose 3 votes, including historically a contempt motion. The confidence is visibly draining from the government, whose majority has always been built on a billion promises. The Prime Minister cannot take this take it or leave it deal, then this House will call time on her. And there's an opportunity for another government to negotiate a deal built on adopting higher regulatory, higher environmental and higher labour standards. If we have higher standards of electoral alignment, our deal will look totally different than the second-rate agreement we've been asked to vote upon. For us to enjoy the same access rights and benefits of the European single market without having to negotiate a whole new treaty, we could apply for membership of the European Free Trade Association and be part of the European Economic Area. This could be completed in a fairly short space of time. However, there is no customs union for EFTA members, and if we want a seamless trade and no tariffs for goods originating outside the UK but being sold into the EU, we need a customs union. Given that it is not possible to be both in EFTA and a customs union, we would secure a derogation from the EFTA Convention in order to facilitate a new EU-UK customs union. This honours the question of the referendum, which simply said, and let's remember what it said, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? Well, we won't be a member of the European Union if we're a member of EFTA. Finally, we could simply remain in the EU. Considering all that we have learned since June 24, 2016, we learnt that negotiating a deal that is better than the one we have now is effectively impossible. That the queue of countries in Whitehall to ask for a trade deal has been oddly missing. That Vote Leave broke electoral law, overspending by hundreds of thousands of pounds, and Cambridge Analytica employees admitted they used illegal data harvesting techniques. Considering all that, shouldn't people be given the chance to think again? If there was another vote on whether to stay or leave, I would vote to remain, just as I did in 2016, as there is no better deal for the United Kingdom. So I will vote to reject this agreement, and if the opportunity to vote to renegotiate, join EFTA, or for another vote on EU membership in the parliamentary procedures we are going to undertake after we inevitably vote down the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, I will vote for any and all of these. I will not vote for the Prime Minister's blank cheque withdrawal agreement, and I'll oppose a no-deal Brexit with every fibre of my being.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the referendum, I was a reluctant Remainer. I appreciated that our relationship with the EU was not perfect. I acknowledge that there are changes that many of us would like to see made. I, like so many, felt that the EU was often a remote and arrogant bureaucracy. But there is not a doubt in my mind that the deal brought back by the Prime Minister is not what was promised to those who voted to leave. Not taking back sovereignty, but giving more of it away. Desperately accepting rules that we have no control over, in order to cling on to access to our largest trading partner for goods and in order to keep our countries together, at the same time as completely ignoring services which make up 80% of our capital's economy. Why should someone in Liverpool, Newcastle or Sunderland care about London's economy? Because right now, London and the South East are the only regions who generate more taxes than they spend. So if London gets hit, so do the hospitals, schools and services of our other great towns and cities. Perhaps it shouldn't be that way, but it is. The idea that we can make ourselves smaller as globalisation becomes faster and stronger, whilst comforting, is unlikely to be successful. As a bloc of 28 nations standing together against the likes of Google, Facebook and Amazon, we are a far more effective bulwark against the most excesses of these amazing global companies who can have extraordinarily negative impacts on some of the most vulnerable towns and people. I've been amazed at the politicians and commentators who blithely suggest that our economy can take a hit would be a price worth paying. We all know that the people who get hit first are always the poorest. I don't believe that anybody voted to make us poorer. I don't believe that anybody voted for us to debate for 2.5 years and choose a worse deal than one we currently have. And I certainly don't believe that anybody voted to see our country opt for a monumental act of self-harm. We have thousands of people sleeping rough on our streets, higher now than at any point under this government. We have over 130,000 children who will wake up trapped in unsuitable temporary accommodation on Christmas morning. And at my local A&E, we already have patients queuing out of the door, indicating that last year's winter crisis will be but a preface to the problem that lies ahead this year. And yet, meanwhile, here we are still debating about the level of uncertainty and destruction that we should plunge our economy and country into. Take the plans to reopen the Wilson Hospital in my constituency, halted after the funders pulled out to Brexit economy uncertainty. Why would we choose to give ourselves self-inflicted wounds costing billions of pounds when we still have the chance to say no? What's the alternative? Looking back to 2016, I know so much more about how the impact of leaving the European Union than I did then. I suspect that's true for all of us. We gave the responsibility for deciding on whether we should leave the EU to the people of this country, and now we know the terms of the deal on the table. Those same people deserve to have their say. Now, the practical consequences of Brexit are there for all to see. Yeah, the debate hasn't been that long. Almost 2/3 of my constituents support a vote on the deal. The costs and complexity are clearer now than at any stage during the referendum, and it is evident that there is no majority in Parliament for this deal, because the one thing that unites both sides of the debate is that nobody voted for the deal that's on the table. Parliament is in gridlock, but there is a clear solution. Let the people decide.
Thank you. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I like to think that you've been employing the Emery effect tonight by keeping me on the bench so I can come on and make a late impact. So thank you for that. It's not often I see one of the Scots Tories speaking and I think of our president. But I've got to say I thought of it tonight, and I was reminded during the rather tortured contribution of the honourable member from Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who's no longer in his place, by the quote from George Bush, who said, "I have my own opinions, strong ones. I just don't always agree with them." Mr. Speaker, I would be right to be greatly concerned by this deal that's on offer. I think justifiably. It is a democratic outrage that Scotland has been dragged out of the EU, or is being dragged out of the EU against the people's vote in Scotland. 62% voted to remain. All 32 local authorities voted to remain. And tonight, as we've heard in the Scottish Parliament, all of the opposition, all of the parties in the Parliament, with the exception of the Tories, have voted 92 to 29 to reject the deal on offer. I would also be greatly concerned, rightly greatly concerned, Mr. Speaker, by the as what was described as the economic illiteracy from my colleague, the Honourable Member for Dundee East earlier, when he pointed out that this is already costing £600 per person per year. And Scottish Government analysis says that in Scotland this deal will make Scotland £9 billion worse off by 2030. That's £1,600 per person per year. Even the Chancellor himself admitted that this is going to make our economy smaller. Mr. Speaker, I would be right to be concerned by those things, but the thing that worries me most is what we are becoming in this place, and the message that we've heard from many honourable members and right honourable members in this chamber tonight about the message that's sent out about what we feel about other people in other countries. I've had the great honour of performing a function, it's an unpaid role, as an honorary consul for Romania since 2011. That's the time I've been doing it both unofficially and officially. And I can tell you that the European citizens, those European nationals, those Romanians who come to work in the Highlands and Islands are fantastic people. They have all made a genuine contribution to our communities. They've slotted in as friends, as neighbours and as contributors to our communities. They've been part of the fabric of our communities. And I can say the same for the Poles, for the French, for the Germans, for all of the citizens that are EU nationals that have contributed to the Highland economy. Because Brexit doesn't only have consequences for business, the economies and communities. It affects each of us as individuals, our very identities. There is a quote from the Scottish Government's national outcomes that I'd like to read to you. It says, Scotland's national and cultural identity is defined by our sense of place, sense of history and sense of self. It is defined by what it means to be Scottish, to live in a modern Scotland and to have an affinity with Scotland and to be able to participate in Scottish society. A flourishing economy and society depend on ambition and self-confidence in Scotland and on Scotland's effective integration into the European and global economy. Our international reputation will influence the extent to which people see Scotland as a great place in which to live, learn, visit, work, do business and invest. A good quality of life and a strong, fair and inclusive national identity are important if Scotland is to prosper and if we are to achieve sustainable economic growth. That's the kind of Scotland that I want to live in, and our European identity and our shared EU values are very much at the heart of this. I've spoken earlier about the vote in Scotland, the overwhelming vote. Yet European Scots face not only the economic and social impacts of Brexit, they face losing their European identity. And there was a nice piece in the Sunday Herald a while back in 2016 that said Scotland has been an outward-looking European nation since the late Middle Ages. From the 16th century, Scots merchants, academics and soldiers spread far and wide in the continent, establishing communities in countries like Poland, Sweden and the Low Countries. Our bond, our connection with European nations is deep and strong and long-lasting. In the Highlands, we've long had a problem with emigration, not immigration, Mr. Speaker. Our deepened relationships with the EU have presented an opportunity for us to welcome EU Scots to our region, a great many of whom, as I've said, have settled in the area and contribute to our economy. And already the UK Government's obsession with unrealistic and counterproductive one-size-fits-all net migration targets overlooks the incredible value of migrant people to our isles and the different economic needs of the Highlands and Islands, and of course those of Scotland as a whole. Over the next 10 years, 90% of Scotland's population growth is projected to come from migration, and this is especially vital for the Highlands. Mr. Speaker, there isn't as much time tonight as I would like to have to be able to explain in depth the importance that EU nationals have to the Highland economy and the importance of our people who go across to work and live and contribute and other EU nations have to us. It is quite simply the fabric of what we do. And this deal, and any no-deal scenario that might be proffered by the Prime Minister, do nothing, absolutely nothing for the people of Scotland wherever they have come from. And I will be absolutely proud to be with my colleagues in voting down that deal when it comes before this House. And I will say, finally, that once again, the actions of this UK government in ignoring Scotland, ignoring their people and ignoring their Parliament only make the case for the independence of Scotland much stronger.
Boss Charalambus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the saddest things to have come out of the Brexit referendum vote on the 23rd of June 2016 has been the rise in racism and the fear and uncertainty felt by EU citizens living in the UK, and also those from non-EU countries living here also. I've heard from constituents in my constituency of Enfield Southgate who are EU nationals, married to UK citizens, working in UK institutions, paying taxes in the UK, making a positive contribution to our society, who are now seriously worried about their future, fearing that their family will be torn apart by the confusion caused by the government's position on EU citizens living and working in the UK. Give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Would he also agree with me it's having a huge impact on children, such as children I met recently at a primary school where their parents are unsure about their own future, let alone where their children will be going to school?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. It's something that I've noticed as well, speaking to children. I'm a governor of 2 schools, and that's also a factor that's been raised with me. Although the government's proposed settlement scheme may help some of my EU constituents living in Enfield Southgate, the withdrawal agreement does not guarantee the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in EU countries will be protected. If my previous and current experience of the Home Office is anything to go by, I have no confidence that the Home Office will be able to cope with the 5 million or so settled status applications that it will have to process. The Home Office is even struggling to cope with some of the Windrush claims. How it will cope with settled status applications is anyone's guess. It's a shame that the government have not produced their immigration white paper yet. We're being asked to approve this deal blindly when immigration was one of the reasons why people voted to leave. The truth is that for years the government have been trying to show that it's tough on immigration, but rather than have an honest debate about it, it has decided to kowtow to every knee-jerk reaction of every negative news story about immigration just to look good. The latest net migration statistics out last week show that the number of EU migrants coming to the UK was 74,000, whereas the number of non-EU migrants was 248,000. It seems that the government have been unable to control migration since they promised to do so when they came in power in 2010. We need to have a sensible debate about migration to this country. This country needs migrants here. As of the 1st of January 2018, the UK was ranked 153rd in the world for percentage population growth, with a rate of just 0.52%. Considering that we're all living longer and the population growth in the UK is stagnating, we need migrants to keep the NHS running, to work in our care industry, to work in the hospitality sector, to collect crops and package the produce from our farms. We live in a global world where collaboration is part of everyday working life. In May of this year, I visited the Institute of Cancer Research, where I met scientists, researchers and doctors from all over the world, all working together to help develop a cure for different types of cancer, trying to discover the relationship between lifestyle choices and causes, and looking at genetic cell mutations and how they can be prevented. All this collaboration is done for our benefit, and the idea that barriers will be put up to restrict this good work is just madness. Collaboration on a global level also takes place in virtually every sector, whether it be finance, advertising, creative industries, the nuclear sector, or even creative industries. Many orchestras and artists and performers work with international colleagues and need to be able to do so to ensure that we have the very best cultural enrichment and that it is shared across the world. My parents are immigrants. They came to the UK from Cyprus in the 1960s. They worked hard and made a positive contribution, claim to an immigrant heritage. We'll have similar stories to tell. We should celebrate the contribution of immigrants to the UK life that it makes. It makes us all the richer, as I've outlined above. I've heard the stories of non-UK workers being picked up in vans from street corners to go and work on building sites, being paid a fraction of the minimum wage, thus undercutting what UK workers would get paid. I say, let's go after those using these sharp employment practices and make sure that no one is able to be paid less than the minimum wage, and that people's employment rights and health and safety at work are protected. The Prime Minister described the withdrawal agreement as taking back control of our borders. Well, the current immigration figures show that nothing of the sort is happening right now. The Prime Minister also said that the UK's immigration policy will be based on skills and talents that a person has to offer. Well, this fails to take account of the EU workers who provide seasonal unskilled labour in agricultural and hospitality sectors, to name but a few. And worse, we've yet to see the draft immigration white paper. This withdrawal agreement makes us worse off. It's not good for jobs and the economy, and I'll be voting to reject the deal on Tuesday.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This has been an excellent debate covering a range of vital and urgent issues, and I'm not going to repeat the many compelling points made by the Shadow Home Secretary in her speech. I cannot do adequate justice to all the other 48 other contributions that have been made, some of which I have missed, but I'm told that there was a typically brilliant speech by the Honourable Member for Caerphilly. But in the time I have available, let me highlight those which I believe best sum up why the Prime Minister's proposed Brexit deal would leave us less secure as a country and would not deliver the fair rules for migration that we need. 2 out of Labour's 6 tests failed in one debate. As my right honourable friend, the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, said, we are being asked to make this decision without even seeing the immigration white paper that we were promised, and therefore with no detailed idea of what the new migration rules will say or how they will work in practice. And as she also said, we are being asked to support a political agreement which is entirely silent on our future access to the SIS2 database and will therefore leave our police and security services less well able to protect the public than they are at present. And as the former university minister has pointed out, if we are being cut out of the Galileo database, even while the agreement is being discussed, what hope do we have of negotiating access to other vital databases once the agreement has already been signed? And we also heard an important contribution from the member from Newcastle under Lyme, who talked about not just his German lessons at school, but the lessons of history that our place in the world is not strengthened but diminished when we cut ourselves off from Europe, a point that was also made by the member for Ealing Southall. From the chair of the Health Select Committee, we heard grave consequences of the dangers of this deal, and even worse, no deal, for the National Health Service, both in terms of medical supplies and of medical staff, something that the Foreign Secretary should understand better than anyone, because it was what he used to say when campaigning for Remain. And we are reminded by the member for Cardiff North, not just that EU cooperation and networks help keep our country safe from crime and terrorism, but that the Prime Minister personally fought to keep us part of when she was Home Secretary, but now cannot guarantee will continue. And both the member for Cardiff North and the member for Hornsey and Wood Green also rightly said, and I agree with them, that far from helping to maintain Europe's leadership on the issue of climate change, the single biggest threat to the world's long-term security, this political agreement cannot even guarantee that we will continue to agree a common position in future international negotiations. Indeed, let us note, it used to be one of the warnings against a no-deal Brexit that Britain could lose access to the EU emissions trading scheme. But even this supposed deal does not guarantee that continued access and only says that the parties should, quote, consider cooperation. Just one of so many areas in the foreign policy sections of this document where clear existing agreements on cooperation have been replaced by vague, loose aspirations. So what this debate and all of the many contributions have laid bare is that our first duty, the first duty of every government, the duty to protect the safety and security of its citizens, the Prime Minister's deal fails. And I hope that when the Foreign Secretary speaks in a moment, he will address those points that I've already mentioned. Access to vital security databases. No, I've been asked to not take interventions at this stage in the evening. We've had a very long debate. And we've had an opportunity over the last 8 hours for everyone to have...
Manners, Mr. Duncan.
Mr. Duncan, please calm down. I've been asked not to take interventions at this stage, and I'm not going to. So, when the Right Honourable Members had a chance to calm down, perhaps I can continue.
Red Leicester over there.
So, what this debate and all the many contributions have laid bare is that on the first duty of every government, the duty to protect the safety and security of its citizens, the Prime Minister's deal fails. And I hope, when the Foreign Secretary speaks in a moment, he will address those points that I've already mentioned. Access to vital security databases, our future international cooperation with the EU, our ability to tackle terrorism and organised crime, our place in the world, our shared fight against climate change, and even the future of our NHS. And I hope that he will answer one other very specific question, which goes to the heart of his responsibilities as Foreign Secretary. Now, he was proud to announce yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the new embassy his department is opening in the Maldives, one of 12 new posts due to be opened by the government over the next 2 years. But even after those new openings, there will still be 16 other countries around the world where Britain has no direct consular representation, where other EU countries do. Countries with a combined population of 72 million people, spread across Asia, Latin America and Africa, including 10 past and present members of the UN Security Council. Countries where, up until this point, thanks to the Common Foreign and Securities Policy, any British citizen visiting, working or living there who found themselves in difficulty could not look to a British embassy for help, had the right to go to other EU embassies based there and ask for consular support. Now, my colleague, the member for Bishop Auckland, last week asked the government what provision was being made in the Prime Minister's proposed deal to continue those arrangements after we leave the EU. And the answer was none. In fact, it's worse than that. The answer was that British citizens arrested in those countries or affected by a hurricane or an earthquake could no longer ask the French or Spanish embassies to help, but they could, and I quote, phone the Foreign Office switchboard. And if we needed any more evidence of how half-baked, hurried through, totally botched the Prime Minister's deal is and how reliant it is on vague future aspirations of cooperation, it is the fact that the government has not even bothered to think about what it means for British citizens being left without consular support in dangerous situations. It is the very definition of making the British people, who our first duty it is to protect, less safe and less secure. And that is not the only loss of security I hope the Foreign Secretary will address in his closing speech tonight, because it is the first duty of the government to protect the physical security of its citizens, but the second duty is surely to protect the economic security of the nation, a point made so well by my friend, the member for Coventry South. And what we have learned with this Foreign Secretary is that he is very willing, quite often, to say one thing about the economic impact of Brexit behind closed doors of Downing Street, and another when he's in the television studios or standing at this dispatch box. And when he is trying to sell this deal to Parliament tonight, I hope he will clear up some of the disparities between what he says publicly and what he says privately. And I have 3 questions for him to that end. In the television studios, Mr. Speaker, he says this is the best deal for Britain. We can look forward to a glorious era where, and I quote, we will become an independent sovereign power negotiating our own trade deals around the world. But round the Cabinet table, he says the opposite, presumably informed by the Attorney-General's legal advice, that this deal will leave us in what he calls a turkey trap, stuck in an exclusive trading agreement with the EU, but unable to influence any of its decisions and unable to negotiate our own deals. So will the Foreign Secretary tell us tonight? What does he really think? Secondly, in the television studios, Mr. Speaker, when asked to talk about the backstop, the Foreign Secretary says it simply will not happen. And he says, again, I quote, "Britain will be an independent trading nation. It is in black and white. That is the intention of the EU." But round the Cabinet table, he says the opposite. The backstop will become a front stop, he says. As soon as the deal is signed, he says, the EU will have what they want, he says. They will block any progress, he says, on the final new trading agreement and will turn the backstop into the only available outcome. So again, will the Foreign Secretary tell us tonight, what does he really think? Thirdly, and finally, Mr. Speaker, in the television studios, the Foreign Secretary says, and I quote, will we not be significantly worse off as a result of the Prime Minister's deal? But didn't the Foreign Secretary used to say the exact opposite around the Cabinet table, especially about the impact on the NHS when he was warning of the need to avoid a hard Brexit? I hate to say it, Mr. Speaker, but I have to agree with the Chief Secretary and the remarks she made over lunch last Monday. She said this: the Foreign Secretary is so charming, but there is no consistency. And she was absolutely right. And she was absolutely right. But even more damning was her explanation for the inconsistency. And excuse me, Mr. Speaker, for using the Foreign Secretary's name, but I'm quoting his Cabinet colleague. Hunt, she says, is all about the game playing. And doesn't that sum it all up, Mr. Speaker? Doesn't that sum it all up? A Tory cabinet obsessed with their own internal powers games and fighting like ferrets in a sack to succeed their lame duck leader. With a Foreign Secretary who, according to his own cabinet colleague, and the evidence of this debate, has been more interested in playing leadership games than making sure that this political agreement would maintain our future foreign policy cooperation with the EU and protect the security of British citizens, whether at home or abroad. That is the kind of front bench we see before us today. And in the light of their complete failure of leadership and in the light of their total...
Order. No, it's not boring to me. Sir Alan, you're normally a figure of dignity in one way or another. You're a little overexcitable. Calm yourself. You really need to get a grip. You're not only a knight, you're a KCMG, a figure of enormous celebrity in the life of the nation. And I know you don't underestimate the importance of all that, so a tad of dignity would be greatly appreciated. Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is the kind of front bench we see before us today. And in the light of their complete failure of leadership, in the light of their total failure to deliver a new set of fair rules on immigration and to protect our country's security, it is absolutely no wonder that this House is only a week away from rejecting their dismal Brexit deal and already holds this dismal government in total and utter contempt.
And the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I saw off, I think, 4 Shadow Health Secretaries, a number of Shadow Culture Secretaries, and tonight I have to say, when I was called charming by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, I nearly blushed, and I want to thank her for the compliment, and I will assume she cannot possibly have meant the other less gracious things she said about me, but I will thank her for this one happy moment in my dispatch box career. And we have had a good debate this afternoon and this evening on the implications of the Brexit deal. I want to thank all honourable members for their contributions. I unfortunately didn't hear the contribution from the honourable member for Berwick, Roxburgh and Selkirk, but I heard that he made a particularly thoughtful speech about the dilemmas in everyone's mind and the conflicts of loyalty to party, government, country, and particularly to voters who voted to leave the EU. And we should not pretend that this is an easy decision for anyone. And I want to commend those honourable members on all sides who emphasised the obligation that collectively rests on all of us to fulfil the mandate of the referendum and take Britain out of the EU. Now, I can't mention every honourable member who spoke this afternoon, but I do want to mention my honourable friends for Wokingham, Ribble Valley, Carlisle, Newton Abbot, St Austell, Poole and East Worthing, who all spoke with passion about how those who voted to leave the EU deserve respect for their views rather than indignation. And in particular, the honourable member for Ribble Valley spoke with great passion about Leave voters who felt that nobody is listening to them, and that if Parliament decided not to listen to them, that would be wholly dangerous. And this was not just on this side of the House that those sentiments were expressed. They were also expressed by honourable members for Blythe Valley, Knowsley and Newcastle-under-Lyme, who reminded us that their constituents voted by clear margins to leave the EU. And there was common ground even with the honourable member for Hackney North, don't always say that, who said that we must honour and respect the referendum result. And I will say to the House, the fundamental aim of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration is to make good on the verdict of the referendum. And that is why they have been painstakingly negotiated for the last 2 years. Now, we did hear some passionate arguments for a second referendum from the honourable members for Mitcham and Morden and from Putney and from Totnes and indeed for others. And I sat in the Cabinet with the honourable member for Putney, and I always listened carefully to her many excellent contributions. And in my last role, I learned to listen very carefully to the honourable member for Totnes and her excellent contributions to this House. But I found myself on this rare occasion agreeing more with comments such as those from the honourable member for Blythe Valley, who said that his constituents would ask if we had a second referendum, why we didn't then have a third referendum or a fourth referendum. And they would do that for a simple reason, which is that if we did have another referendum, and let's say the result was reversed, and 48% of the country voted second time round to leave and 52% voted to remain. In that situation, there would be 48% of the country who had voted 2 times in a row to leave the EU, and they would be incredibly angry. And that is why my right honourable friend, the member for Sevenoaks, was right in saying that a second referendum would not settle this issue. Yes, I'll give way to the honourable lady.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. But actually what he's saying is not correct. This is not about rerunning the referendum 2 years ago. This is about putting the decision now, 2 years on, back to the people to say, is this what we really want now the evidence is clear?
I would simply say to her that she should just have conversation with the Leave voters in her constituency and ask them if they agree with that view, because I think Leave voters have a very simple message, which is they just want us to get on with it. And I think we have to ask ourselves truly whether it would settle the issue in their minds were we to go back and ask people a similar question again. I'll give way one more time and then I'll perhaps make some progress.
Very grateful for giving way, but isn't he also neglecting the angry people who are now not being listened to, who voted to remain in the European Union, because they are angry too?
Well, let me do something, again, I think a world first for me from this dispatch box, and actually praise the Liberal Democrats, because you at least have been completely consistent from the start that you want to reverse the result of this referendum. I'm afraid other honourable members have been hiding behind various devices and saying they don't want to reverse the result of the referendum when they actually do. And I think Leave or Remain, this is a moment we have to remember that we are above all a democracy in this country, and it would be incredibly dangerous if we were to not listen to what people have asked us to do. Now, I'll give way one last time to my right honourable friend, and then I will make some progress.
But he wasn't going to give way. But isn't the point here that either way, it's unlikely to be resolved decisively
in any referendum that might command, say, 60 or 65% of the electorate, which the referendum in 1975, I think he's too young, actually did. Well, I thank him for his flattering comment about my age, but I agree with him. I think that is the issue. It would not resolve the issue, but I think if it was reversed, it would actually make the very same people who said the political class, the political elite weren't listening to them, even more convinced that that was the case. And that is the danger in that. Now, the Shadow Foreign Secretary talked about foreign affairs and security. And I just want to touch on that briefly. And my starting point on that is very simple, that however profound, however significant, however important Brexit might be, it doesn't change one simple fact, and that is that no European country has done more for the defence and security of Europe than Britain. And that partnership long predates our membership of the EU. In 1940, this country rejected any thought of abandoning Europe, even at the risk of invasion and national ruin, and joined forces with the United States and other allies to launch the liberation of the continent in 1944. And then Britain and the United States, with our European friends, strove to build a new world order based on rules and institutions rather than power and militarism. And every British government, regardless of party, has acted in the spirit of that tradition. A Labour government setting up NATO, Margaret Thatcher standing shoulder to shoulder with Ronald Reagan against the Soviet threat, and the EU too, through its establishment of a rules-based order in continental Europe, and the generous and far-sighted opening up to post-Soviet accession countries, which played a central role. So I particularly commend the Honourable Member for Newcastle under Lyme for reminding us of this historical perspective, which is, in short, a partnership of shared values stretching across political and national divides from left to right across the Atlantic, including EU and non-EU members, which has kept the UK and Europe safe. And the political declaration aims to enhance this partnership, and the task of putting this into practice will begin on the day the deal is agreed. So as European countries commit to that partnership going forward, so my right honourable friend the Prime Minister has shown by word and deed that Britain's commitment to the security and defence of Europe remains unconditional and immovable. Indeed, right now, in the middle of the Brexit debate, the British Army comprises the single biggest element of NATO's enhanced forward presence, safeguarding Poland and the Baltic states. And that's why the declaration allows the closest relationship in foreign and security policy the EU has ever had with a third country. And Part 3 makes it clear that where and when our interests converge, then Britain and the EU will be able to combine efforts to the greatest effect, including in times of crisis. And I want to reassure the Honourable Member for Ealing Southall, who was worried about our country becoming isolated, that that is not going to happen. So where we agree with the EU, we will act together. Where we disagree, we will be free to act independently or with others. But we won't be constrained by the lowest common denominator of a common foreign policy. And as my right honourable friend the Home Secretary described earlier, Britain will be given unprecedented scope to cooperate with the EU to protect our citizens from terrorism and organised crime as we regain parliamentary control of our immigration policy. And here we had a number of important contributions, including from the Honourable Member from Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, from Edinburgh South and Hackney North. And I want to reassure them that under the withdrawal agreement, our law enforcement agencies will continue to use EU tools and databases throughout the transition period, including SIS2 and ECRIS, and as the transition period concludes, paragraph 87 states that we have agreed to continue to exchange information on wanted or missing persons and criminal records, and that our future relationship should include those capabilities. And I sense an intervention coming on. Why did I think that might happen?
Can you tell me what the timetable will be for the negotiation of a security treaty and its full ratification, and whether it will be completed within the transition period?
Well, because negotiations involve two parties, I can't tell him when they will conclude, but it is the clear intention of both sides that they should conclude before the end of the transition period at the end of 2020. So in summary, the future security partnership envisaged in the declaration would enable British and EU law enforcement agencies to share essential data, including passenger name records, fingerprints, DNA and vehicle registrations. Likewise, the Honourable Member for Normanton raised the arrest warrants issued for the alleged Salisbury murderers, obviously an issue of close interest to me as Foreign Secretary, and I can assure her that as part of the future security partnership, we have agreed to swift and effective arrangements enabling the UK and Member States to surrender suspected and convicted persons efficiently and expeditiously. Now, many honourable members, including the Honourable Member for Motherwell and Wishaw, Hornsey and Wood Green, Streatham, Lewisham West, spoke passionately about the contribution made by Poles and other EU nationals in their constituencies. And I entirely share those sentiments, as do my constituents in South West Surrey. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, made clear how this country will treat the millions of EU citizens who live among us with decency and generosity under all circumstances. I hope and believe that our neighbours will act in the same spirit towards Britons who reside in the EU. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful for the Secretary for giving way. Does he believe that it's treating them with fairness and dignity and respect to charge them for maintaining their status here? Does he honestly believe that's the right kind of signal to send out to these people he says are so valued?
Yeah, exactly. Good question. Well, what I would say is that we make charges to cover administrative costs, just as EU countries make charges for administrative costs that our citizens incur when in their countries. But what is really significant when it comes to generosity is the fact that we have made this offer unconditionally. We've made it before any reciprocal offer was made by EU countries in return, and that is a sign of how much we value the extraordinarily important contribution they make to our national life. Now, my honourable friend for East Surrey, in a very dignified speech, raised the issue of Galileo, and I regret that the EU has unwisely made it impossible for Britain to remain a full partner of the Galileo satellite communication system. Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, described the EU's behaviour on this as strategic folly of the first order. So we will develop a plan for a sovereign system of our own, because when the EU rejects cooperation, the United Kingdom is perfectly big and confident enough to develop our own alternatives. But if this House rejects the declaration and withdrawal agreement, and we leave the EU without a deal, then our security cooperation with our closest neighbours would be put at risk. And the reason is because such cooperation would depend, in a no-deal situation, not on any agreement, but on goodwill, and that could well be missing. So at a time when threats are evolving and cross-border collaboration has never been more important, our law enforcement agencies would not have the guaranteed channels that they currently have for exchanging essential information from our EU neighbours. Yes, I give way to my honourable friend.
The Secretary of State would agree, however, that there would be another option here, and that would be to extend Article 50, and that actually presenting the House with a false choice that we would automatically fall out on the 29th of March is incorrect, is it not?
I just think, and I know I had a conversation with her earlier this evening about how lively things are in her own constituency, but I think if any of us asked our own constituents whether they thought the right solution to the dilemmas we face is actually to extend the agony by postponing the Article 50 due date, I think they would be absolutely horrified. They want to get this over with, they want to get this resolved. And I think that but going back to the risks of a no-deal situation to our security, this was recognised by my honourable friend, the member for Preseli, Pembrokeshire, my honourable friend for Ludlow, my honourable friend for Banbury, who all made comments that alluded to these issues. So, in conclusion, when it comes to defence and security, irrespective of our membership of the EU, the lesson of history is clear. When Britain and Europe stand together against common foes, then our combined strength deters our adversaries and keeps the peace. If we do not, our common security is placed at risk in a way that is wholly unnecessary. So let us grasp this opportunity for a new and different partnership
post-Brexit, based on the essential truth that British and European security are indivisible, and whether inside or outside the legal structures of the EU, our common interests are best served by working together to protect the values we all cherish.
Order. The question is that the debate be now adjourned. As many as are that are going to say aye? Aye. If the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. Debate to be resumed what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. Order.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.